Hello there, and welcome to Midnight Geography. Tonight we'll drift into the geography of North Carolina, where ancient mountains meet coastal mysteries and the land holds stories written in stone and water. North Carolina is where geology performs its slowest dance. Peaks that once rivaled the Himalayas now worn smooth by time. Rivers that carved paths before humans walked these valleys, and a coastline that shifts with every tide and storm. It is a place where elevation changes more dramatically than almost anywhere in the East, where underground chambers hold formations older than language, and where the Earth itself remembers when continents collided. If you enjoy these peaceful geographical explorations, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other curious minds find their way here too. But for now, let's begin. Mount Mitchell stands at 6,684 feet above the sea, the highest peak east of the Mississippi River, rising from the Black Mountain Range like a sentinel over western North Carolina. The summit exists in a different climate than the valleys below. Temperatures average 15 to 20 degrees cooler than nearby Asheville, creating conditions more akin to forests found in Canada than the American South. Here, Fraser fir trees cling to rocky slopes, their needles adapted to the harsh winds and ice that coat these heights for months each year. The mountain was named for Elisha Mitchell, a professor who died in 1857 while attempting to verify its elevation, his body found at the base of a waterfall during his solitary measurements. Standing at the summit, you can see mountain ranges stretching in every direction, wave after wave of ancient peaks fading into blue distance, each one a remnant of forces that once pushed rocks skyward when this continent was young and restless. The Linville Gorge drops away suddenly from the surrounding landscape, a 2,000-foot chasm carved by the Linville River through stone that remembers the dawn of complex life. Often called the Grand Canyon of the East, though the comparison feels insufficient. This is something older, something more intimate in its wilderness. The walls are composed of quartzite, a rock formed from sandstone compressed and crystallized over 1 billion years, making it older than most fossils, older than eyes or bones, or the first creatures that left the ocean. The gorge maintains a wild character that resists easy access. Hawks circle in the updrafts, riding air currents that pour up from the river below, and the sound of falling water echoes against stone walls that have stood since continents assembled and drifted apart multiple times. Few trails penetrate the gorge's depths, and those that do require scrambling over boulders and wading through cool water that has been flowing through this channel since before mountains elsewhere had even begun to rise. North Carolina's coastline measures 301 miles, where it meets the Atlantic Ocean, in a relatively straight line. But this simple measurement conceals a more complex truth. When you account for every sound and inlet, every tidal creek and river mouth, every curve and fold where salt water reaches inland, the tidal shoreline extends to 375 miles. Imagine tracing with your finger every edge where water touches land. The journey would take you through vast sounds that separate barrier islands from the mainland, up rivers that widen into estuaries where fresh water meets salt, around thousands of marsh islands that appear and disappear with the tides. This is geography measured not in straight lines, but in the patient work of water finding every possible place to reach. Herons stand in the shallows at dawn, their stillness a meditation on waiting, while tides move in and out twice daily, rearranging sand and salt grass, writing and erasing the same story in an endless rhythm that predates human observation. The Outer Banks form a delicate chain of barrier islands stretching 200 miles along the coast, a necklace of sand between ocean and sound. These islands are not fixed monuments, but living, moving landforms that shift westward at an average rate of 5 to 6 feet per year. Sand erodes from the ocean-facing beaches during winter storms, carried by waves and currents, then gets deposited on the sound side, causing the entire island to migrate slowly toward the mainland. In geological time, these islands are temporary features, sandbars that rise and fall with sea levels, migrate with currents, and respond to every major storm by reshaping themselves. Historic records show how inlets open during hurricanes and close again years later, how villages once located inland from the beach now stand at the water's edge, how lighthouses built safely back from the waves have had to be moved as the Atlantic claimed the ground beneath them. The islands are both barrier and boundary, protecting the mainland from full ocean fury, while themselves remaining vulnerable to every northeast wind. Grandfather Mountain rises distinctly from the surrounding Blue Ridge, its craggy profile visible for miles, particularly the famous mile-high swinging bridge that spans a gap at exactly 5,280 feet elevation. But the mountain itself reaches higher still, to 5,946 feet at its true summit, where rock formations tell stories from 300 million years ago. The mountain's foundation consists of a complex of different rock types pushed together and thrust upward during the collision of ancient continents. What makes Grandfather particularly striking is its isolation. Unlike Mount Mitchell, which rises as part of a high range, Grandfather stands somewhat apart, its distinctive profile created by erosion that carved away softer surrounding rock while leaving this resistant mass intact. Cherokee legends speak of the mountain's face, seeing in its ridges and cliffs the profile of an old man lying on his back, forever watching the sky. Wind constantly shapes the summit's vegetation, stunting trees into twisted forms that grow more horizontally than vertically, creating natural bonsai gardens where the elements are the gardeners and patience is measured in decades. Lake Mattamuskeet spreads across 40,000 acres of Hyde County in eastern North Carolina, yet averages only 2 to 3 feet in depth, a vast, shallow pan of water that reflects clouds and sky like a mirror stretched across the coastal plain. This curious geometry creates unique ecological conditions. The lake is so shallow that aquatic plants can root almost everywhere, creating underwater meadows that support waterfowl populations that have been arriving here for millennia during their migrations. In winter, tens of thousands of tundra swans gather on Mattamuskeet, their white forms covering the surface, their calls carrying across the water in the early morning. The lake occupies a Carolina bay, an oval depression whose origin remains somewhat mysterious, perhaps formed by wind and water during different climate periods, gradually excavated from the coastal plain. During summer, the water warms quickly in the sun, and at dawn, mist rises from the surface like breath, creating conditions where the edges of lake and air become uncertain, where herons fishing in the shallows appear to stand in fog rather than water. The New River flows northward through Ashe and Allegheny counties in North Carolina's northwest corner, following a course it has maintained for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Geologists estimate the New River is between 260 and 360 million years old, making it one of the oldest rivers in the world, older than the Atlantic Ocean itself, older than the Appalachian Mountains in their current form. The river was here before these mountains rose, and as the land lifted slowly around it, the New River simply carved downward through the rising rock, maintaining its ancient path. This process, called superposition, created the deep gorge through which the river now flows. The water moves with patient persistence, never hurrying, finding its way through rhododendron thickets and beneath sycamore trees, past farms that represent only the most recent moment in its long history. Native Americans fished these waters, early settlers built mills along its banks, and now kayakers float through its Class II rapids, but the river continues as it has for hundreds of millions of years, indifferent to the brief human attention it receives, flowing toward its eventual meeting with the Kanawha River in West Virginia. Roan Mountain straddles the North Carolina-Tennessee border, and across 850 acres of its high slopes, no trees grow despite elevation and climate that should support dense forest. These grassy balds remain one of the mountain's persistent mysteries. Unlike lower meadows maintained by grazing or fire, the high balds on Roan Mountain seem to maintain themselves through processes that ecologists still debate. Some theories suggest centuries of grazing by now extinct megafauna. Others point to soil conditions or periodic fire, but no single explanation fully accounts for why these particular slopes remain open when forest surrounds them on every side. The balds occur above 6,000 feet elevation, where weather can change in moments from sunshine to fog to driving rain. In June, rhododendron blooms transform the slopes into waves of purple and pink, creating gardens that seem impossible at such heights. The Cherokee people considered these mountains sacred, sensing perhaps what visitors still feel, a quality of openness and exposure, of standing on the earth's surface where sky and land meet without the forest's mediation, where wind moves unobstructed across grass that bends and rises like waves. The Great Dismal Swamp extends into northeastern North Carolina from Virginia, a vast wetland whose name belies its rich biodiversity and strange beauty. At the swamp's heart sits Lake Drummond, positioned almost perfectly at the center, as if the swamp grew around it. The lake's water holds a deep brown color, stained by tannic acid leached from juniper and cypress trees, from the slow decomposition of organic matter in acidic water. This dark water has a quality of depth beyond its actual measurement, reflecting sky and trees in shades of amber and rust. The swamp itself comprises thousands of acres of forested wetland, where water stands among tree trunks, where the ground is neither fully land nor water, but something in between. Cypress trees grow with their roots submerged, developing distinctive knees that protrude above the waterline. The swamp remains a place of stillness. Even bird calls seem muted by the heavy air and dense vegetation. In the 19th century, enslaved people found refuge in the dismal swamp's difficult terrain, creating communities in places where pursuers would not follow, adding human stories of freedom and resistance to a landscape already saturated with other forms of life. Chimney Rock rises suddenly from the surrounding landscape in Rutherford County, a massive granite spire protruding 315 feet above the forest that surrounds its base. From its top, on days when atmospheric clarity allows, views extend 75 miles across the Hickory Nut Gorge and beyond into the Blue Ridge. The rock formation is what remains after millions of years of erosion removed softer material, leaving this resistant granite monolith standing like a finger pointing skyward. The rock face itself shows the effects of weathering. Lichens grow in patterns across the stone, and in crevices where soil collects, small plants establish precarious footholds. For countless generations before European settlement, this landmark served as a gathering place and hunting ground for Native Americans who recognized the rock's spiritual significance. Now, a stairway of more than 500 steps leads to the summit, each step following the cliff face upward through air that becomes cooler and thinner with elevation. From the top, you can watch turkey vultures soar below you, riding thermals that rise from the gorge floor, their wings spread motionless as they circle in patterns that haven't changed since long before humans climbed to watch them. North Carolina contains 17 distinct river basins, each one a complete hydrological system draining its portion of the state's surface. Some rivers flow eastward toward the Atlantic. Others flow westward, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi system, and the line that divides these directions, the Eastern Continental Divide, runs through the state's western mountains. This invisible boundary determines the fate of every raindrop, whether it will eventually mix with the Atlantic or the Gulf, whether its journey will take it through sounds and estuaries or down the Tennessee and Ohio rivers. The divide doesn't follow a single mountain ridge, but wanders irregularly, sometimes crossing valleys, responding to subtle variations in topography. A spring on one side of a mountain might feed a stream flowing toward Pamlico Sound, while just over the ridge, another spring contributes to waters bound for the Mississippi. This geography of drainage creates a map beneath the visible map, a network of gravitational pathways where water always finds the lowest route, gathering from thousands of small sources into larger flows, each basin a complete system of tributaries and branches that converge like the veins on a leaf. Blowing Rock sits at the rim of Johns River Gorge in Watauga County, a cliff edge where the physics of air create something unexpected. When northwest winds blow across the gorge, they encounter the cliff face and are forced upward, creating a powerful updraft strong enough to blow lightweight objects back up instead of letting them fall. Snow blown off the cliff in winter rises instead of falling, and in earlier times, before modern regulations, visitors would throw hats or handkerchiefs and watch them return. The phenomenon results from the cliff's configuration and the prevailing wind direction. The gorge acts like a channel, concentrating and directing the wind upward against the rock face. Cherokee legend explained the updraft differently, as the breath of a sky spirit who lives beneath the cliff, pushing air upward from below. The rock itself commands a view across the Johns River Gorge to Grandfather Mountain beyond, and in autumn, when leaves change color, the vista becomes a demonstration of how elevation affects vegetation, different species turning red and gold at different heights, creating horizontal bands of color that mark temperature zones as clearly as any thermometer. The Uwharrie Mountains rise from the Piedmont region of central North Carolina, gentle slopes covered in oak and hickory forest, showing no sign of their violent origins. These hills are what remains of peaks that once stood over 20,000 feet tall, formed 500 million years ago during a period of intense volcanic activity when tectonic forces built mountains that dwarfed today's Appalachians. Imagine those ancient peaks, higher than the Himalayas, their jagged summits catching storms, their slopes raw and steep. Then imagine time passing, not years or centuries, but hundreds of millions of years, as weather and erosion worked patiently to dismantle those giants grain by grain, carrying their substance away to distant seas. What we see now in the Uwharrie Range are merely the worn-down roots of those ancient mountains, their volcanic rock exposed, their once towering heights reduced to hills that barely reach 1,000 feet. Yet even in their diminished state, they hold evidence of their past. The rock here differs from surrounding Piedmont geology, volcanic formations, signs of the magma chambers that once fed those ancient peaks. Walking through these hills, you walk across the stumps of mountains that stood when life was just beginning to colonize land, when fish had not yet developed jaws. Cape Hatteras extends into the Atlantic like a bent finger, marking the point where two major ocean currents meet. The cold Labrador Current flows south along the coast, carrying water from Arctic regions, while the warm Gulf Stream passes close to the Outer Banks here, bringing tropical water northward. Where these currents collide, mixing waters of different temperatures, different densities, different chemical compositions, the ocean becomes treacherous. Waves form complex patterns, tides become difficult to predict, and storms intensify as they pass through the region. Since the 1600s, over 2,000 vessels have wrecked in these waters, giving the area its grim nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Ships lost include everything from colonial schooners to World War II submarines, their remains scattered across the ocean floor, slowly being buried by shifting sand or exposed again by storms. The famous Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, with its distinctive black and white spiral pattern, stands as a warning to ships, though the lighthouse itself has had to be moved as the island beneath it eroded away. The Cape remains a place where ocean forces dominate, where human efforts to navigate or control the sea face constant reminders of nature's superior power and patience. Fontana Lake spreads across 10,530 acres in the valleys between mountain ridges, created when Fontana Dam was completed in 1944, backing up the Little Tennessee River. The lake reaches depths of 440 feet in places where the original river valley cut deepest, and its shoreline extends over 240 miles, following the contours of the drowned valleys. When the dam was built and the valley flooded, several small communities disappeared beneath the rising water. Roads, homes, and cemeteries were relocated, but the landscape itself, the shape of the valley, the pattern of ridges, was preserved underwater, creating a submerged topography that mirrors the mountains surrounding it. Now the lake lies still and deep, reflecting the peaks of Great Smoky Mountains National Park that rise on its northern shore. In early morning, before wind disturbs the surface, the reflection becomes so perfect that it's difficult to distinguish where mountain ends and image begins. The lake provides a sharp contrast to the wild character of surrounding wilderness, a created feature in a landscape of ancient formations, yet one that has existed long enough now that eagles nest along its shores, and the lake has become part of the ecosystem rather than merely an intrusion into it. The shoals extending from Bald Head Island reach 6 to 8 miles offshore into the Atlantic, creating a treacherous maze of shallow water where multiple currents converge near the Cape Fear River mouth. These shoals are constantly shifting sandbars built up by sediment carried by the river and rearranged by ocean currents. The depth changes seasonally, even daily, as storms move sand in unpredictable patterns. For centuries, these shoals posed the primary obstacle to ships entering or leaving the Cape Fear River, requiring local pilots who maintained detailed knowledge of the current channels, though even their expertise couldn't eliminate the danger. The shoals create a natural barrier that affects everything. They determine where waves break offshore, creating lines of white water visible from shore. They influence fish populations by providing shallow habitat, and they deflect ocean currents in ways that affect the entire coastline. Under the surface, the sandy bottom supports its own ecosystem. Flounder bury themselves in sand, rays glide over the bottom, and during summer, sharks patrol the channels between shoals. The shoals represent a boundary zone between river and ocean, between sediment-laden freshwater and clear salt water, a mixing ground where neither system dominates completely. Looking Glass Rock rises above the forest near Brevard as a massive exposed face of granite, the rock gleaming when wet, visible for miles. The rock face climbs 1,700 feet above the valley floor, an almost sheer wall of stone that formed deep underground as molten rock cooled slowly into granite, then was exposed as overlying material eroded away. The surface shows the effects of exfoliation weathering. The granite is peeling away in layers, thin sheets of rock that detach as the stone expands, and contracts with temperature changes over thousands of years. When rain or ice coats the rock face, it takes on a mirror-like quality, reflecting light in a way that gives the formation its name. The bare rock supports little vegetation, occasional lichens and crevices, a few stunted trees where soil has accumulated in cracks. But its nakedness reveals the stone's structure, the patterns of its crystallization, the lines where different episodes of cooling created distinct layers. Climbers come to test themselves against looking-glass rock's face, following routes up the granite that require equal measures of strength, skill, and nerve. But the rock itself remains indifferent to these brief touches, weathering and exfoliating at its own pace, gradually wearing away while appearing completely solid and permanent. North Carolina's geography encompasses an extraordinary range of elevation compressed into a relatively modest distance. From sea level, where waves lap against beach sand at the Atlantic coast, to 6,684 feet at Mount Mitchell's summit, the state rises more than a mile vertically over approximately 380 miles of horizontal distance. This dramatic elevation change creates multiple climate zones within a single state. The coast experiences mild winters and hot summers moderated by ocean breezes. The Piedmont lies in a transitional zone with 4 distinct seasons, and the mountains know cold that can persist for months at high elevations. Drive from the Outer Banks to the Blue Ridge, and you travel through ecosystems that would normally be separated by hundreds of miles of latitude, from maritime forests adapted to salt spray, through oak hickory forests of the Piedmont, into northern hardwood forests that resemble regions far north in New England, and finally to spruce fir forests at the highest elevations where conditions mirror those of southern Canada. This compressed diversity means that North Carolina contains remarkable biological variety. Species that rarely coexist occupy different elevation zones within the state, creating gradients of life that respond directly to the geography's vertical dimension. The Nantahala River cuts through southwestern North Carolina, dropping an average of 40 feet per mile as it flows through the Nantahala Gorge. This steep gradient creates continuous rapids, not the dramatic waterfalls of steeper descents, but a constant tumbling of water over rocks, a river that never quite settles into calm flow. The gorge itself rises on both sides, containing the river in a channel where sunlight reaches the water only at midday, giving the river its name. Nantahala derives from a Cherokee word meaning land of the noonday sun. The steep valley walls are covered in forest that has never been cleared. Hemlock and rhododendron grow so densely that the slopes appear dark green even in full summer. The river's cold water comes from higher elevations, remaining cool enough throughout the year that it requires respect from anyone who enters it. In spring, when snowmelt swells the flow, the rapids intensify, and the river demonstrates the power that carved this gorge through rock over millennia. The sound of moving water fills the gorge constantly, white noise that drowns out other sounds, creating an acoustic environment dominated entirely by the river's voice, speaking in countless tones simultaneously. Pilot Mountain rises abruptly from the surrounding Piedmont Plain near Winston-Salem, an isolated peak that commands attention precisely because it stands alone. The mountain reaches 2,121 feet at its summit, but what makes it distinctive is the way it rises. Not as part of a range, but as a solitary monadnock, a peak of erosion-resistant quartzite that remained standing while softer rock around it wore away over millions of years. The summit consists of 2 knobs: Big Pinnacle, a bare rock tower that rises sheer from surrounding forest, and Little Pinnacle, slightly lower and more rounded. The quartzite that forms these knobs is over 1 billion years old, some of the oldest exposed rock in the eastern United States. From the Piedmont floor, Pilot Mountain appears like a monument, its distinctive profile visible for dozens of miles. The Sara people, who lived in this region before European contact, considered the mountain sacred, a place where earth reached toward sky. Later, settlers used it as a landmark for navigation, hence its English name. Now state park trails wind around the mountain's base and lead to the summit of Little Pinnacle. Big Pinnacle itself is too fragile and steep for public access, but the essential character of the mountain remains, a singular peak standing above horizontal landscapes, wearing away slowly while maintaining its prominence. The Albemarle Sound spreads across northeastern North Carolina, a vast body of water spanning 50 to 60 miles in length and reaching 14 miles across at its widest points. This is not quite ocean and not quite river. It's brackish water, that in-between state where fresh water from multiple rivers meets the salt influence of the Atlantic, creating conditions that shift with seasons and tides. The salinity varies throughout the year, higher in summer when less rainfall flows from tributary rivers, lower in spring when rivers swell with snowmelt and rain. This fluctuation creates a dynamic ecosystem where both freshwater and saltwater species exist, though neither group fully dominates. The sound is shallow enough that wind can raise significant waves, yet deep enough to have served as a major transportation route since before European colonization. Native peoples navigated these waters in canoes carved from cypress logs, and later, the sound became a highway for commerce as ships carried lumber, agricultural products, and naval stores between inland communities and the Atlantic. On calm mornings, the water reflects the sky so perfectly that horizon disappears. You cannot tell where water ends and air begins, creating a space that feels like floating in emptiness, suspended between surface and reflection. Linville Caverns extend beneath Humpback Mountain in the Blue Ridge, passages carved through limestone by underground streams that flow even now. The caverns maintain a constant temperature year-round, a cool 52 degrees, as if the mountain itself is breathing at a steady rate regardless of seasons passing above. Within the darkness of these chambers, streams support a population of blind trout, fish that have adapted to perpetual lightlessness by losing their eyes entirely. Over countless generations, the trout evolved away from vision, that expensive biological investment rendered unnecessary in an environment where no light ever penetrates. Instead, they navigate by sensing vibrations in the water, detecting the minute movements of their prey through lateral lines running along their pale bodies. The fish appear ghostly, nearly translucent, as if they're becoming part of the water itself. The caverns feature formations built by patient deposition, stalactites growing downward from the ceiling, stalagmites rising from the floor, sometimes meeting after thousands of years to form columns. Water drips constantly, each drop carrying dissolved minerals, each drop contributing an infinitesimal layer to formations that grow at rates measured in centuries per inch. Walking through the caverns, you move through geological time made visible, through spaces carved and decorated by processes that continue while the surface world spins through its brief concerns. The Yadkin River begins in the Blue Ridge Mountains and flows 215 miles through the heart of North Carolina, draining approximately 7,200 square miles, nearly a fifth of the state's entire land area. The river's character changes dramatically along its journey. In its headwaters, it's a mountain stream tumbling over rocks, cold and clear, cutting through forested slopes. As it enters the Piedmont, it widens and slows, meandering through agricultural land and small towns that grew up along its banks. The river has been central to human settlement for millennia. Native Americans established villages along its course, attracted by abundant fish and the fertile bottomlands. Later, European settlers built mills at every suitable rapid or fall, harnessing the river's power to grind grain, saw lumber, process cotton. Many of these mill sites still exist, stone foundations and mill races visible even where the mills themselves have long since fallen. The river continues beyond North Carolina's border, becoming the Petey River as it flows into South Carolina and eventually to the Atlantic. But throughout its length, it remains fundamentally the same water, the same flow, carrying sediment from mountain slopes toward the sea, a liquid pathway through the landscape that has been following the same basic route for millions of years. Hanging Rock State Park takes its name from a distinctive quartzite formation that cantilevers outward 200 feet from the main cliff face at 2,150 feet elevation. The rock appears to hang in space, defying the gravity that should pull it down, though of course it's anchored firmly to the mountain. It's the surrounding rock that has eroded away, leaving this projection extending over the valley below. Stand on top of Hanging Rock, and you stand on stone that extends beyond any support visible beneath you. Air on all sides, except the single connection back to the mountain. The quartzite here belongs to the Soratown Mountain Formation, rock rich in quartz that resists weathering more effectively than surrounding materials. From the rock's edge, views extend across the Piedmont, that transitional zone between mountains and coastal plain where the land rolls in gentle waves rather than rising in peaks. In morning, fog often fills the valleys below, creating the illusion that Hanging Rock rises from clouds, an island of stone floating in white emptiness. The rock's surface shows the patient work of lichens, those symbiotic organisms that slowly break down stone, contributing in their small way to the erosion that, over geological time, will eventually bring even this resistant formation down to the level of the plains below. The Neuse River travels 275 miles from the Piedmont to Pamlico Sound, beginning as a modest stream in Person County and transforming into one of the widest river mouths in the United States. As the river approaches the coastal plain, it widens dramatically, expanding to over 6 miles across near where it enters the Sound. This gradual widening creates a transition zone, a place where the river loses its river-like characteristics and becomes something closer to an estuary, influenced by tides mixing fresh and salt water. The wide lower Neuse moves slowly, its current barely perceptible during much of the tidal cycle, its surface often mirror-smooth in early morning before wind disturbs it. Along its banks, cypress trees grow with their roots in water, their reflections creating perfect symmetry. The river has shaped human settlement patterns for centuries. Native American villages clustered along its banks. Colonial settlements grew at river crossings and landings. And even now, communities orient themselves toward the Neuse. The river carries not just water, but history, sediment, nutrients from inland regions toward the coast. Fish migrate up the Neuse to spawn, returning to the same tributaries where they were born, following chemical signatures dissolved in water, navigating through memory encoded in their cells. Shackleford Banks stretches 9 miles along the southern Outer Banks, a barrier island where wild horses roam freely across dunes and maritime forest. These horses are descended from Spanish Mustangs, though how they arrived remains a matter of speculation. Perhaps from shipwrecks, perhaps deliberately released by early explorers, perhaps escaped from failed colonial settlements. Regardless of their origin story, the horses have lived on this island for centuries, adapting to conditions that seem impossible for large mammals. There is no freshwater source on Shackleford banks, no springs or streams, yet the horses survive by drinking rainwater from temporary pools and consuming dew-covered vegetation in early morning. Their bodies have adapted to tolerate higher salt intake than mainland horses, and they've learned to paw through sand to reach rainwater that is filtered down and collected above the denser sand layers below. The horses live in small bands, each occupying a territory along the island's length. They are small, sturdy, adapted to sparse forage and harsh weather. In winter, they grow thick coats. In summer, they stand in the surf to escape biting flies. The island itself shifts beneath their hooves, sand moving with every storm, dunes building and eroding, yet the horses remain, as much a part of Shackleford's landscape as the sea oats and tide. The French Broad River defies the expected pattern of rivers in this region by flowing northward through Asheville and beyond, one of the few rivers in North America that contradicts the general southward flow toward the Gulf or Atlantic. The river's northern course seems counterintuitive until you consider that it follows valleys established long before the Appalachian Mountains rose to their current heights. As the mountains lifted, the river maintained its course, cutting downward through rising rock, creating a path that now seems to ignore the mountain's general orientation. The French Broad is ancient. Some geologists consider it among the oldest rivers in the world, potentially predating the mountains it flows through. Its waters begin in North Carolina, but eventually join the Tennessee River system, carrying water from the Blue Ridge all the way to the Mississippi and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. Along its course through Asheville, the river flows broad and relatively calm, its surface reflecting buildings and trees, but upstream and downstream, it narrows and quickens, cutting through gorges where rock walls close in on both sides. The river's name comes from the colonial period, when French Broad distinguished it from other rivers, marking territory where French influence competed with English claims, though the river itself paid no attention to such human boundaries, flowing as it had for millions of years before empires arrived to draw their lines. Crowder's Mountain rises 800 feet above the surrounding Piedmont landscape near Gastonia, an abrupt vertical intrusion in a region of gentle hills. The mountain formed from volcanic rock created 450 million years ago during a period of intense geological activity when island arcs collided with the North American continent. The collision created chains of volcanic islands that eventually merged with the mainland. Their lava and ash solidified into rock that now forms several prominent peaks across the region. The rock here differs from the granite and gneiss that characterizes much of the Piedmont. It's darker, harder, more resistant to erosion, which explains why Crowder's Mountain still stands prominently, while softer surrounding rock has worn away to lower elevations. The mountain slopes support forests of oak and hickory that give way to pine at certain elevations, creating horizontal bands of vegetation visible in autumn when leaves change color at different rates depending on species. From the summit, you can see Charlotte's skyline to the east, a reminder of how close wilderness and city coexist in this region. Hawks ride thermals up the mountain's face, circling higher without flapping their wings, using the updrafts created when wind meets the steep slopes. The mountain serves as a landmark visible for miles, a reference point that has oriented travelers for as long as humans have moved through this landscape. Lake Norman spreads across 32,510 acres north of Charlotte, North Carolina's largest man-made lake, created when Cowan's Ford Dam was completed on the Catawba River in 1963. The lake's shoreline extends 520 miles, following the drowned contours of river valleys, wrapping around peninsulas and into coves that once were side valleys feeding the main river channel. The depth varies dramatically depending on the original topography. Over 100 feet deep where the old river channel ran, shallow across what were once bottomlands and tributaries. When the valley flooded, it buried farmland, roads, small communities, and the landscape of an earlier era. Trees were cut before flooding, but their stumps remained, and in drought years when the lake level drops, these stumps emerge again, creating ghost forests that testify to what existed before. The lake has become its own ecosystem now, supporting populations of fish that attract herons and ospreys, its shoreline grown up with vegetation that seems to have always been there. In early morning, mist rises from the water's surface, and the lake appears timeless, as if it's always existed in this valley, though in geological terms, it represents merely the most recent moment, a brief pause before the river, which still flows beneath the surface, continues its ancient journey toward the sea. The Roanoke River enters North Carolina from Virginia and winds through the northeastern counties, creating floodplain forests that experience dramatic seasonal changes in water level. During spring, when snow melts in the Virginia mountains and rain swells the watershed, the river overflows its banks, spreading across the floodplain in a sheet of water that can remain for weeks or months. These extended floods create unique habitat. Trees standing in water for extended periods develop adaptations similar to swamp species, and the forest floor becomes an underwater landscape where fish swim through what will later be dry land. When floods recede, they leave behind nutrient-rich sediment deposited across the floodplain, creating exceptionally fertile soil that supports dense vegetation. The seasonal flooding also creates challenges for trees and other plants. They must be adapted to tolerate both saturated and dry conditions, both underwater periods and summer droughts. Bald cypress and water tupelo thrive in these conditions, their roots adapted to low oxygen environments, their growth patterns responding to the rhythm of flood and recession. The floodplain serves as critical habitat for migratory birds that arrive in spring to find shallow water rich with aquatic insects, perfect conditions for raising young before the water recedes and the landscape transforms back into forest floor. Jockey's Ridge State Park protects the tallest natural sand dune system on the Atlantic coast, a massive accumulation of sand that fluctuates between 80 and 100 feet in height, depending on wind patterns and seasonal variations. The dune is not fixed, but actively migrating, sand blown from the windward side and deposited on the leeward side, causing the entire formation to move slowly westward like a wave frozen in extreme slow motion. The sand itself is composed of quartz grains eroded from Appalachian mountains, carried by rivers to the coast over millions of years, then sorted and deposited by ocean currents and shaped by wind into dunes. Stand on top of Jockey's Ridge, and you stand on mountain remnants, on rock that once formed peaks hundreds of miles inland, now ground down to individual grains and reassembled into this coastal feature. The dune's surface ripples with wind patterns, creating miniature ridges and valleys that change daily, sometimes hourly, as gusts shape and reshape the sand. In strong winds, sand moves visibly, streaming off the dune's crest like smoke. The dune supports almost no vegetation, a few hardy grasses at its edges, but the crest remains bare sand, too unstable and salt-laden for plants to establish. This barrenness creates a landscape more reminiscent of deserts than the forested coast just beyond the dune's base, a pocket of emptiness maintained by constant wind. The Haw River flows 110 miles through the Piedmont, a river that demonstrates how human and natural history intertwine. The river's course passes over numerous granite outcroppings where the underlying bedrock rises to the surface, creating natural rapids and falls. These locations became obvious sites for mills. The falling water provided power for grinding grain, sawing lumber, processing cotton. Along the Hawes length, you can still find evidence of this industrial past. Stone foundations of mills, remnants of mill races that diverted water, dams in various states of decay. Some of these structures date to the early 19th century, representing 200 years of weathering and abandonment. Now the river flows around and over these ruins, slowly reclaiming them, wearing them down just as it wore down the granite bedrock over much longer timescales. The Hawes water carries a brown tint from sediment, from the clay and sand eroded from its banks, and from tributaries draining agricultural land. In flood, the river rises quickly, its flow powerful enough to move boulders, but most of the time it flows gently, supporting populations of fish and mussels, visited by herons that stand motionless in shallows, waiting. The river connects points. Its tributaries reach into Orange and Alamance counties, gathering water from a wide area, concentrating it into this single channel that eventually joins the deep river to form the Cape Fear. Whiteside Mountain rises near Cashiers with sheer cliff faces that drop 400 to 750 feet, among the oldest exposed rock surfaces on Earth. The granite here formed 390 million years ago from magma that cooled deep underground, then was exposed as overlying material eroded away. What makes Whiteside particularly dramatic is not just the cliff's height, but its sheerness. These are vertical to overhanging faces where rock meets air with no gradual transition, no talus slopes of broken stone, just solid cliff dropping to the forest below. The rock face shows the effects of time. Water seepage has created dark stains running down the granite, and in winter, ice forms in cracks, slowly prying the rock apart in a process that will eventually, over millions more years, bring these cliffs down. Lichens grow on the exposed stone, splashes of color against gray granite, each colony representing decades or centuries of slow growth. From the top of Whiteside, reached by trails that approach from behind the cliffs, views extend across multiple mountain ranges, each ridge line receding into blue distance. Ravens nest on the cliff face, and their calls echo against stone, amplified and distorted by the rock walls. The mountain has a quality of permanence, as if it has always existed exactly as it appears now, though in truth it's constantly changing, constantly weathering, constantly in process of being slowly dismantled by rain and frost and time. The Lumber River winds through Robeson County in southeastern North Carolina, a blackwater stream that flows beneath a dense canopy of cypress trees. The water is stained dark brown, almost the color of strong tea, by tannic acid leached from decaying vegetation in the surrounding swamps. This dark water creates unusual visual effects. It's difficult to judge depth, and reflections of trees and sky are more vivid than in clear water, as if the tannins concentrate and intensify reflected light. The river moves slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, its current gentle enough that leaves floating on the surface seem motionless. Along its banks, cypress trees grow directly from the water, their trunks widening at the base into buttresses that provide stability in saturated soil. Spanish moss hangs from branches, creating curtains of gray-green that sway in the slightest breeze. The river has been designated a National Wild and Scenic River, recognition of its relatively undeveloped character, its ecological value. Fish adapted to acidic water thrive here, and the river serves as corridor for wildlife moving through a landscape that has been largely converted to agriculture and development. In early morning, mist rises from the black water, creating a scene that appears timeless, unchanged from how this river might have looked centuries or even millennia ago, before human settlement altered the surrounding landscape. Stone Mountain State Park preserves a massive granite dome that rises 600 feet above the surrounding forest in Allegheny County. The dome is a pluton, a mass of granite that formed underground and was exposed by erosion of overlying rock. The granite face shows characteristic features of such formations. It's smooth in most places, broken by occasional cracks and joints where water has penetrated and weathering has begun to separate blocks. Water staining creates dark vertical streaks down the rock, minerals dissolved from the granite and redeposited, painting the stone in shades of rust and black. The dome's exposed surface makes it inhospitable to most vegetation. Occasional stunted pines grow in cracks where soil has accumulated, and lichens cover portions of the rock, but most of the face remains bare stone. A waterfall cascades down one section of the dome, water that has flowed over the same path for so long that it has worn a smooth channel in the granite. The surrounding forest makes the bare rock seem even more stark. A sudden absence of green, a space where mineral rather than vegetable dominates. From the base, looking up at the dome's curve rising overhead, you can sense the massive weight of stone, the solidity that has allowed this formation to resist, while softer rock around it eroded away, leaving the granite standing prominent above the Piedmont landscape. The Tar River extends 180 miles from Person County through the coastal plain to Pamlico Sound, named for the naval stores industry that once operated along its banks. Colonial settlers tapped longleaf pine trees and collected the sap, then processed it into tar, pitch, and turpentine, products essential for maintaining wooden ships. The pines that provided this raw material are largely gone now, harvested centuries ago, but the river's name preserves that economic history. The river's character changes along its length, beginning as a narrow stream in the Piedmont, widening and slowing as it enters the coastal plain. In its lower reaches, the river becomes tidal, its direction of flow reversing with the tides, salt water pushing upstream during flood tide, fresh water flowing seaward during ebb. This creates a brackish zone where species from both marine and freshwater environments coexist. The river carries sediment eroded from its watershed, suspended particles that give the water a brownish tint, evidence of the land through which it flows. In flood, the tar rises well beyond its normal banks, inundating floodplain forests that are adapted to these periodic inundations. The river has flooded repeatedly throughout recorded history, and each flood reshapes the channel slightly, erodes banks in some places, deposits sediment in others, demonstrating that even a seemingly permanent feature like a river is actually in constant motion, constantly revising its own geography. Max Patch spreads across the North Carolina-Tennessee border at 4,629 feet elevation, a grassy bald offering unobstructed views in every direction, a full 360-degree panorama of mountain ranges receding into distance. The bald is maintained by periodic mowing and grazing to prevent forest succession, keeping the summit open as it has been for generations. Stand on Max Patch, and you stand on a place where earth and sky meet with minimal mediation, where wind blows unobstructed across grass that ripples like water. In every direction, mountain ridges line up in successive waves, each one slightly paler than the last, fading through shades of blue into the distance where mountains and sky merge. The grass here is kept short, creating a surface more like lawn than meadow, and this maintained character gives Max Patch a quality different from wilderness. It's a landscape actively shaped by human intention to preserve a particular appearance. In spring, wildflowers bloom among the grass. In summer, the open exposure creates conditions where thunderstorms can develop quickly. In autumn, the surrounding forests turn color while the bald remains green. And in winter, snow covers the summit, creating a white dome visible from valleys on all sides. The Appalachian Trail crosses Max Patch, and hikers often rest here, spreading out on the grass, feeling small against the mountain panorama, experiencing the peculiar sensation of being simultaneously exposed to vast space and grounded to solid earth. The Lumber River flows through some of North Carolina's most distinctive coastal plain features, moccasins, which are raised peat bogs found only in this region. The word comes from an Algonquian term meaning swamp on a hill, which captures the odd character of these ecosystems. Moccasins form on slight elevations in the coastal plain, where poor drainage and acidic conditions have allowed peat to accumulate over thousands of years. The peat consists of incompletely decomposed organic matter, building up because the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions slow decomposition. Plants growing in moccasins must be adapted to nutrient-poor, acidic soil, and this harsh environment has produced some remarkable evolutionary adaptations. Carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps and pitcher plants grow here, supplementing their nutrient intake by capturing and digesting insects. The Venus flytrap, that famous plant with jaw-like leaves that snap shut on prey, grows naturally nowhere else in the world except a small region of North Carolina's coastal plain. Pitcher plants use a different strategy, creating tubular leaves filled with digestive fluid where insects drown and are slowly absorbed. These plants demonstrate how life adapts to extreme conditions, finding unexpected solutions to nutritional challenges. The moccasins themselves are dense with bay trees and tangled vegetation, difficult to penetrate, remaining wild in a region where much land has been drained and converted to agriculture. Carver's Gap sits at 5,512 feet elevation, where the North Carolina-Tennessee border crosses the Roan Highlands, marking a natural passage through the mountains. This gap has been used as a route for millennia, first by megafauna moving between valleys, then by Native Americans following game trails, then by early European settlers seeking passages through the mountains. Gaps like this one form where erosion has carved deeper valleys, creating low points in mountain ridges, and they serve as natural corridors for both wildlife and humans. Stand in Carver's Gap, and you stand at a place where geography shapes history, where the land's topography influences patterns of movement and settlement. The Gap offers access to the Roan Mountains' grassy balds. Trails lead from here to those open summits where rhododendrons bloom in June. The elevation at Carver's Gap places it at the transition zone between different forest types. Below lie northern hardwoods. Above grow spruce fir forests adapted to harsher conditions. Wind funnels through the gap, concentrated by the mountain walls on either side, creating conditions where trees grow in flags, their branches swept toward the leeward side by constant prevailing winds. In winter, the gap can be bitter cold, exposed to weather moving through, while in summer, it offers relief from the heat of lower elevations, a place where the air itself feels different, thinner, clearer. The Catawba River originates in the Blue Ridge Mountains at elevations above 3,000 feet and flows 220 miles through North Carolina, dropping over 1,500 feet from its source to the South Carolina border. This substantial drop in elevation creates the conditions for substantial hydroelectric development. The Catawba and its main tributary, the Linville River, support 11 dams that generate power while creating a chain of lakes. The river's name comes from the Catawba people who lived along its banks, and the river served as the center of their territory, providing fish, transportation, and water for the crops they cultivated in bottomlands. The river's flow varies dramatically with seasons. Spring floods can swell it to many times its low flow volume, while summer droughts reduce it to a fraction of its normal size. This variability has been altered by the dams, which moderate flow by releasing or retaining water as needed for power generation, creating a more regulated system than existed naturally. Yet the river remains fundamentally the same water, the same drainage of a particular watershed, gathering rainfall and snowmelt from hundreds of tributaries, concentrating it into this single channel flowing toward the sea. Along its length, the Catawba connects points, communities, ecosystems, elevations, serving as a liquid thread through the landscape, moving perpetually from high to low, from mountain to plain, following gravity's patient instruction. Frying pan. Mountain Lookout Tower stands at 5,340 feet elevation in Pisgah National Forest, one of the few remaining fire towers in North Carolina still staffed during fire season. The tower rises above the surrounding forest canopy, providing observers with panoramic views across mountain ranges that extend in every direction. From this vantage point, a trained eye can spot the first wisps of smoke from miles away, can distinguish between morning fog and the haze that precedes fire. The tower's continued use represents a connection to an earlier era of forest management, before satellites and aircraft became primary tools for fire detection. The structure itself is designed to sway slightly in high winds, its metal frame flexible enough to bend without breaking, an engineering solution to the extreme weather conditions that can occur at this elevation. Inside, on days when wind rocks the tower and clouds move through at eye level, the observer experiences the mountain from a perspective few others know, above the trees but below the highest peaks, suspended between earth and sky. The tower serves as both practical tool and symbol, a reminder that some tasks still benefit from human presence, from eyes scanning horizons, from patient watching across the seasons as weather patterns shift and forest conditions change. Pamlico Sound stretches 80 miles along North Carolina's coast and spans 15 to 30 miles in width, making it the largest lagoon on the Atlantic seaboard. Despite its vast surface area, the sound averages only 15 to 20 feet in depth, a massive shallow basin where light penetrates to the bottom across most of its extent. This shallowness creates unique conditions. The water warms quickly in summer sun, creating habitat for species adapted to variable temperatures. The sound bottom supports extensive seagrass beds that provide nursery habitat for juvenile fish and feeding grounds for waterfowl. The shallow water also means that wind can raise significant waves quickly. The sound can transform from mirror smooth to white-capped in the time it takes a storm system to cross the horizon. Pamlico Sound receives freshwater input from numerous rivers flowing from the mainland while exchanging salt water with the Atlantic through inlets in the Outer Banks, creating brackish conditions that vary with rainfall, river flow, and tides. The Sound has supported human communities for millennia, first Native American populations who harvested its abundant fish and shellfish, later European settlers who established fishing villages along its shores. Even now, the Sound remains central to coastal economies and ecosystems, a vast shallow space where water meets land, where salt and fresh water blend, where biological productivity reaches levels that support everything from microscopic plankton to dolphins patrolling the channels. Shortoff Mountain rises along the eastern rim of Linville Gorge, its cliffs reaching 1,500 feet above the river far below. The mountain's name describes its most prominent feature: sheer faces where the rock simply ends, shearing off vertically into air. These cliffs are composed of Chilhowee quartzite, an exceptionally hard and erosion-resistant stone that weathers to a distinctive white color. The quartzite formed from ancient beach sands, compressed and metamorphosed, then tilted and uplifted during mountain-building events. Now those former beaches stand vertical, exposed as cliff faces that catch sunlight and glow almost luminous against the darker forest. From the edge of Shortoff Mountain, views extend across the entire breadth of Linville Gorge, that massive canyon carved through billion-year-old stone. The perspective from these heights offers an unusual sense of scale. You can see hawks circling below you, their wings catching sunlight as they ride updrafts rising from the gorge floor. The cliffs create habitat for species that require this particular combination of elevation, exposure, and rock type. Rare plants cling to crevices in the quartzite, species found nowhere else, because nowhere else provides exactly these conditions. The mountain feels remote despite being accessible by trail, perhaps because the sheer drops create psychological distance, a sense of separation from the ordinary world of level ground and gradual slopes. The Dan River flows 200 miles from its origins in Virginia through North Carolina's northern Piedmont, cutting through volcanic rock that dates back to ancient mountain-building events. The river's course reveals the region's geological history. Its channel follows valleys established in rock types that eroded more readily than surrounding formations, creating a path that reflects millions of years of water, finding the easiest route through resistant stone. The volcanic rock here formed during periods of intense tectonic activity, when volcanic islands collided with the North American continent, their lava flows and ash deposits solidifying into stone that now lines the riverbed and forms cliffs along certain stretches. The Dan's flow varies seasonally, surging with spring rains and slowing to a relative trickle during summer droughts, though dams now moderate some of this natural variation. Along its length, the river has served as boundary and highway, marking property lines and providing transportation routes for successive generations of inhabitants. Mill sites along the Dan testify to its role in early industry. Almost every rapid or substantial drop was eventually harnessed for water power, and the ruins of these enterprises still mark the landscape. The river continues its patient work of erosion, grinding away at bedrock, carrying sediment downstream, slowly deepening its channel grain by grain, following the same basic path it has traced for geological ages, while the surrounding landscape has risen and eroded away. Lake Waccamaw occupies a geological depression in Columbus County, spanning 9,000 acres with water chemistry that puzzles and fascinates researchers. Despite being surrounded by typical Carolina Bay waters that run acidic and stained dark with tannins, Lake Waccamaw maintains neutral pH and relatively clear water. The explanation lies in the limestone deposits beneath and around the lake, which buffer the acidity that characterizes other coastal plain waters. This unique chemistry has allowed the lake to support species found nowhere else. Endemic fish and mollusks that evolved in isolation within this single body of water, cut off from other populations by the surrounding acidic waters that they cannot tolerate. The lake formed in a Carolina Bay, one of thousands of mysterious oval depressions scattered across the coastal plain, their origins still debated by geologists. Theories range from meteor impacts to wind and water action during earlier climate periods, but no single explanation fully accounts for all their characteristics. Lake Waccamaw's shoreline alternates between sandy beaches and cypress swamps, between open water and tangled vegetation, creating diverse habitat within a relatively small area. In early morning, when mist rises from the lake's surface and silence settles over the water, the lake seems to exist outside ordinary time, a pocket of calm where the normal rules governing coastal plain chemistry somehow don't fully apply. The Linville River begins high in the mountains and drops 90 feet at Linville Falls, a spectacular cascade where water plunges over multiple ledges of ancient rock. But the falls represent just the beginning of the river's dramatic descent. Beyond the falls, the river continues through Linville Gorge, dropping an average of 2,000 feet over the next 12 miles. This extreme gradient creates continuous rapids and cascades, a river that rarely flows calm, constantly tumbling over rocks and boulders, its voice a perpetual roar echoing off the gorge walls. The force of water moving at such steep gradients carves the channel deeper, grinds boulders smaller, reshapes the stream bed with every flood. During spring runoff, when snowmelt and rain swell the flow, the river becomes an untamed torrent, its power visible in the spray that rises from impacts and the thunder audible for miles. The gorge itself constrains the river, forcing it through a narrow channel where walls rise sheer on both sides, creating a place where water dominates absolutely, where the landscape seems to exist primarily as the river's corridor. Trees growing along the banks lean toward the water, their roots exposed where floods have eroded soil from beneath them. The river carries the cold of high elevations even in summer, its temperature barely warming as it rushes through the gorge, spending too little time in any particular location to absorb much heat from sun or air. Occoneechee Mountain rises 350 feet above the Eno River near Hillsboro, one of the easternmost peaks of the ancient mountain system that once dominated this region. The mountain represents an isolated remnant, a monadnock that remains standing because its rock resists erosion more effectively than surrounding materials. The Occoneechee people, for whom the mountain is named, established settlements near its base, recognizing the strategic advantage of this high ground overlooking the river valley. The mountain slopes support forests that have regrown since earlier clearing, oak, hickory, and pine now covering a landscape that was once more open. From the summit, views extend across the Piedmont's rolling terrain, a perspective that helps reveal the region's character as a transitional zone between mountains and coastal plain. The underlying rock here belongs to the complex of formations that characterizes the Piedmont, metamorphic stone that began as something else, sediments or volcanic deposits transformed by heat and pressure into new forms. Walking through the forest on Occoneechee's slopes, you walk across repurposed geology, across rocks that have been recycled through multiple geological processes, each one leaving its mark in the stone's structure and composition. The mountain has become a place of recreation now, its trails popular with nearby residents seeking a brief escape into terrain that offers elevation change and forest cover within easy reach of town. The Chowan River forms where the Blackwater and Nottoway rivers converge, then flows south toward Albemarle Sound, widening until it reaches 3 miles across at certain points. This dramatic widening creates conditions more like a sound than a river. Tides affect the flow, wind raises waves across the broad surface, and the river takes on characteristics of the estuary it's becoming. The wide lower Chowan moves with barely perceptible current during much of the tidal cycle, its surface often calm enough to reflect clouds and shoreline trees with mirror-like clarity. Along its banks, cypress trees grow in formations that blur the boundary between water and land, forests that extend into the river, their trunks rising from water that varies in depth with tide and season. Spanish moss drapes from branches, its gray-green strands hanging motionless in still air, swaying gently when breeze disturbs the humid atmosphere. The river has served as highway and boundary for centuries, its waters navigated by successive cultures who recognized its value for transportation and fishing. The wide lower reaches allowed sailing vessels to penetrate deep inland, connecting coastal communities with interior settlements, making the Chawan a corridor for commerce and communication long before roads provided alternative routes. Now, the river flows through a landscape that has changed dramatically on land, while remaining relatively constant on water. Forests regrown where fields once stood, but the river maintaining its essential character, still wide and slow, still influenced by tides, still connecting inland regions with the Sounds and eventually the Atlantic beyond. Glassy Mountain in Pisgah National Forest earned its descriptive name from the way rainfall sheets off its bare granite face, creating a surface that appears smooth and reflective as glass when wet. The granite dome rises above the surrounding forest, its exposed stone weathered to a pale gray that contrasts sharply with the green vegetation covering lower elevations. When rain falls on the dome, water doesn't soak in or collect in puddles. Instead, it runs directly off the impermeable rock, gathering speed as it flows downward, creating temporary waterfalls and streams that exist only during and immediately after rainfall. This sheeting effect makes the entire rock face appear liquid when viewed from a distance during storms, as if the mountain itself is melting or transforming into water. The granite's impermeability results from its dense crystalline structure and the relative lack of cracks or joints where water could penetrate. Instead, the rock sheds water, directing it to the base of the dome where it soaks into soil or flows into streams. The bare rock supports minimal life, lichens in patches where minerals collect, occasional stunted trees in crevices where soil has accumulated over centuries. But mostly, the dome remains stone, uncompromising mineral matter that predates and will outlast the forest surrounding it. From certain angles, especially when light reflects off the wet surface, Glassy Mountain lives up to its name completely, appearing as a massive pane of glass propped against the landscape, both present and somehow transparent, solid yet reflecting light in ways that make it seem less than fully substantial. The Yadkin PD River Basin drains 7,221 square miles, nearly 20% of North Carolina's total land area, gathering water from hundreds of tributaries across the central portion of the state. This drainage network functions as the landscape's circulatory system, collecting rainfall from mountain slopes, Piedmont hills, and coastal plain fields, concentrating it into progressively larger channels that eventually merge into a single river, flowing toward South Carolina and the Atlantic beyond. The basin's extent reflects the long history of erosion and drainage pattern development. Rivers find the lowest routes. Tributaries develop branching patterns that resemble tree roots or blood vessels, each small stream contributing its flow to larger creeks and rivers in a hierarchy that has been establishing itself for millions of years. The watershed encompasses dramatically different terrain types, from the Yadkin's mountain headwaters, where cold streams tumble over rocks, through the Piedmont, where the river widens and slows, to the coastal plain, where the PD becomes broad and languid. This variation creates diverse habitats along the river's length. Trout in cold mountain tributaries, bass in Piedmont sections. Completely different fish communities in the lower coastal portions. The basin also encompasses human settlements established precisely because of the river. Towns grew at fording sites, mills located wherever water fell with sufficient force. Cities developed where bridges could be built, or where the river became navigable for larger vessels. The drainage basin thus represents both natural geography and the human response to that geography, a system that has shaped settlement patterns while being shaped in turn by human alterations to flow, channel, and land use. Big Pinnacle rises as the highest point of Pilot Mountain, a quartzite tower that extends above the main mountain mass like a natural monument. The Pinnacle's rock is over 1 billion years old, formed from sand deposited in ancient seas, compressed into sandstone, then metamorphosed by heat and pressure into quartzite, a rock so hard and resistant to erosion that it outlasts almost everything around it. The Pinnacle stands bare and exposed, its vertical faces too steep and smooth for trees to root, its surface weathered, but fundamentally unchanged over human time frames. The rock's color varies with light conditions and weather, sometimes appearing nearly white in direct sunlight, sometimes taking on warmer tones at sunrise or sunset, sometimes dark and brooding under storm clouds. The formation is visible for miles across the Piedmont, serving as a landmark that has oriented travelers for as long as humans have lived in this region. But the Pinnacle itself is off limits to visitors, too fragile, too steep, too dangerous to allow public access. Instead, visitors can reach Little Pinnacle, the slightly lower secondary peak nearby, and from there view Big Pinnacle across a gap, seeing its full vertical extent rising against the sky. The restricted access has preserved the tower in relatively pristine condition, protecting it from the erosion that foot traffic would cause, allowing it to continue standing as it has for geological ages, a remnant of ancient seas and ancient mountains, weathering at its own pace without human interference, accelerating its inevitable wearing away. The Tuckasegee River flows 50 miles through Jackson and Swain counties, dropping approximately 1,200 feet from its headwaters to Fontana Lake. This substantial elevation change occurs over a relatively short horizontal distance, creating a river of constant motion, rapids, riffles, occasional pools, but never long stretches of calm flow. The river's name comes from the Cherokee language, and the Tuckasegee Valley was central to Cherokee territory before forced removal in the 1830s. The valley still holds evidence of that earlier inhabitation: archaeological sites, remnants of towns, the memory encoded in place names and topography. The river itself continues as it did before those human histories, following the valley floor, cutting deeper into bedrock, carrying sediment from high elevations toward the eventual destination in Tennessee River system. The Tuckasegee's water is cold year-round, fed by mountain streams that begin at elevations where snow lingers into spring and air temperatures rarely exceed moderate even in summer. This cold water supports trout populations, creating habitat more typical of regions far to the north, conditions made possible only by the elevation and the constant input of water from high mountain sources. Along certain stretches, the river flows through narrow gorges where rock walls close in, while in other sections, it meanders through wider valleys where floodplains allow the channel to shift laterally over time. These variations in valley width reflect differences in the underlying rock. The river cuts narrow channels through resistant formations, widens where it encounters softer materials that erode more readily. Devil's Courthouse stands at 5,120 feet in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a dramatic rock outcrop that legend says was used by Native Americans for ceremonial purposes. The formation consists of a massive exposure of stone rising above the surrounding ridgeline, its profile suggesting architectural forms, walls, buttresses, towers, that give the feature its courthouse name. Cherokee stories speak of this place as a judgment seat, though the exact nature of the legends varies in different tellings, mixing history and myth in ways that make it difficult to separate what was actually practiced from what has been embellished over generations of retelling. What remains clear is that the outcrop was recognized as significant, a place where Earth's bones show through its skin, where rock masses emerge from the forest and demand attention. The view from Devil's Courthouse extends across multiple states on clear days: Tennessee to the west, Georgia to the south, South Carolina to the southeast, and North Carolina's Blue Ridge stretching north and east. From this elevation and exposure, weather moves through with dramatic speed. Clouds form at eye level, storms approach as visible walls of gray advancing across valleys, and wind constantly shapes the vegetation, stunting trees and creating crumholts, that distinctive growth form where trees become more shrub than tree, their branches growing horizontally, their height limited by wind and ice. The courthouse itself weathers slowly, its rock shedding layers in the process called exfoliation, the stone peeling away in sheets as it expands and contracts with temperature changes over countless cycles of freeze and thaw. Core Sound separates the mainland from the southern Outer Banks, a body of water averaging 2 to 3 miles wide and typically less than 10 feet deep, except in marked navigation channels. The Sound's shallowness creates conditions where bottom vegetation can grow across most of its extent, where wading birds can fish without swimming, where boats must follow carefully marked channels to avoid grounding. The water clarity varies with wind and tide. Calm conditions allow sediment to settle, creating relatively clear water, but any significant wind roils the bottom, putting sediment back into suspension and turning the Sound turbid and brown. This dynamic reflects the Sound's transitional character, neither fully marine nor truly estuarine, affected by tides but also by freshwater input from mainland rivers, its salinity varying seasonally and with rainfall patterns. The Sound serves as nursery habitat for juvenile fish that spend their early lives in shallow, protected waters before moving to deeper ocean environments as adults. Seagrass beds provide both shelter and feeding grounds, creating underwater meadows that support complex food webs. Along the Sound's edges, salt marshes grade almost imperceptibly from water to land, the transition marked more by vegetation changes than by any clear boundary line. Spartina grass grows in zones determined by tidal flooding, species adapted to constant immersion at the water's edge, others growing slightly higher where flooding occurs less frequently. These marshes serve as buffers between land and water, absorbing wave energy, filtering runoff, providing habitat for species that require the exact conditions found where saltwater meets land. Table Rock Mountain rises to 3,909 feet in Burke County, its distinctive flat summit visible throughout the region, a landmark that has oriented travelers and settlers for generations. The mountain's name describes its most prominent feature. From certain angles, particularly from the Piedmont to the east, the summit appears remarkably level, like a table set upon the mountain landscape. The rock forming the summit is Henderson gneiss, a metamorphic stone that began as something else, probably sedimentary deposits or volcanic material, then was transformed by intense heat and pressure deep underground before being uplifted and exposed by erosion. The summit area is smaller than it appears from a distance, a relatively compact space where exposed rock meets stunted vegetation shaped by exposure to elements. The hike to Table Rock's summit is steep and sustained, climbing through forest that transitions from oak and hickory at lower elevations to mountain laurel and rhododendron thickets at mid-elevations. finally emerging above the trees at the summit rocks. From the top, views encompass both mountains to the west and the Piedmont's rolling terrain to the east, making Table Rock a geographic pivot point, a place where two distinct landscapes meet. The rock face below the summit drops sharply, providing habitat for ravens and peregrine falcons that nest on cliff ledges. The mountain's prominence and accessibility have made it popular for hiking, yet its essential character remains unchanged, a mass of ancient stone thrust upward by geological forces, wearing away slowly while maintaining its distinctive profile, visible for miles, serving still as the landmark it has always been. The Little Tennessee River flows northward through Macon and Swain counties for 93 miles before joining the Tennessee River at Fontana Lake, following a course that seems to contradict the expected southward flow of rivers in this region. Like the French Broad and New River, the Little Tennessee's northern route reflects its ancient establishment along valleys that existed before or during the uplift of the Appalachian Mountains. The river maintained its course even as the land rose around it, cutting downward through the rock at the same rate the mountains lifted, creating deep valleys that now seem disproportionate to the relatively modest streams flowing through them. This is river work, measured in geological time, not years or centuries, but millions of years of patient erosion. The Little Tennessee's valley was home to Cherokee communities for centuries, the river providing fish, transportation, and water for the crops cultivated in bottomlands. The flooding of portions of the valley when Fontana Dam was completed submerged some of these historic sites, creating the lake that now fills the lower valley. The river above the lake continues as it has, flowing through mountain landscapes where slopes rise steeply from the water's edge, where tributary streams enter through narrow side valleys, where the sound of moving water echoes off hillsides. In autumn, when leaves turn color, the river valley becomes a corridor of yellow and red, the changing foliage following elevation zones up the surrounding slopes, creating a layered effect that demonstrates how temperature decreases with altitude, each 100 feet of elevation representing a shift equivalent to traveling 50 or 60 miles north. Craggy Gardens occupies the slopes between 5,500 and 6,000 feet elevation in the Black Mountains, where natural rhododendron gardens cover hundreds of acres without any human planting or cultivation. These are Catawba rhododendrons, a species adapted to high elevations and acidic soils. Their roots shallow and spreading, their thick leaves evergreen through winter. In mid-June, the rhododendrons bloom simultaneously, transforming the mountainside into waves of purple and pink, a spectacle that draws visitors from across the region to witness this brief explosion of color at an elevation where growing seasons are short and conditions harsh. The blooms last perhaps 2 or 3 weeks before petals fall, and the mountainside returns to its usual dark green, the brief flowering representing a concentrated burst of reproductive effort before autumn arrives and winter closes in again. The gardens exist in a zone where trees struggle. The elevation, exposure, and soil conditions push against the limits of what forest species can tolerate. As a result, the landscape remains more open than lower elevations, creating meadow-like conditions among the rhododendron thickets. The views from Craggy Gardens extend across the Black Mountains and beyond, each vista encompassing dozens of ridgelines receding into distance. Wind constantly moves across these heights, shaping the vegetation, preventing trees from growing tall, creating a landscape that feels simultaneously exposed and sheltered, exposed to sky and weather, sheltered within the thickets of rhododendron that grow dense enough to create tunnels and rooms within their mass. The Cape Fear River forms near Moncure, where the Deep River and Haw River converge. then flows 202 miles southeastward to the Atlantic Ocean as North Carolina's only major river that reaches the sea directly, rather than emptying into sounds or other rivers first. This direct connection gives the Cape Fear a particular character. It's truly a river-meeting ocean, its mouth opening onto Atlantic swells rather than the calmer waters of sounds or estuaries. The river's name carries ominous weight, though its origin remains debated, perhaps referring to the treacherous shoals at its mouth, perhaps to a specific historical incident, perhaps simply to the challenges the river presented to early navigation. Whatever the origin, the name has endured, marking this as a river that demanded respect from those who navigated its waters or depended on its flow. The Cape Fear drains a substantial portion of central North Carolina, its watershed gathering water from both Piedmont and coastal plain regions. Along its lower reaches, the river widens and slows, tidal influences pushing upstream for miles, salt and fresh water mixing in proportions that vary with seasons, rainfall, and tides. Bald cypress forests line portions of the river, trees growing with their roots in water, creating swamp forests that seem primeval, unchanged from conditions that might have existed centuries or millennia ago. The river carries sediment toward the ocean, tons of material eroded from its watershed, suspended in the brownish water, eventually deposited at the river's mouth or carried by currents along the coast. The river's contribution to the constant process of erosion and deposition that shapes coastlines. Mount Jefferson rises to 4,683 feet in Ashe County, an isolated peak standing 1,600 feet above the New River Valley below. The mountain's prominence results from its composition, harder rock that resisted erosion while surrounding material wore away, leaving Mount Jefferson as a monadnock, an isolated remnant testifying to how much landscape has been removed around it. The mountain is neither the highest nor most dramatic peak in North Carolina, but its isolation gives it particular significance as a landmark visible across the rolling terrain of the northwestern counties. From the summit, accessible by car via a winding mountain road, views extend across multiple states, Tennessee and Virginia visible beyond North Carolina's borders. The mountain has served various functions over human history: strategic lookout, gathering place, recreational destination. But its fundamental character derives from geology, from being the rock that remains while other rock has departed grain by grain, carried away by countless rainfalls, frozen and fractured by innumerable winters, slowly diminished over timescales that make human history seem momentary. The slopes support northern hardwood forests, birch, maple, cherry, species more typical of regions far to the north, brought south by elevation and the cooler temperatures that occur at higher altitudes. In autumn, these trees create spectacular color displays, the mountainside transforming into a patchwork of red, orange, and yellow that stands out against the surrounding valleys, where different species following different seasonal rhythms create their own patterns of change. Croatan Sound connects Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds, a channel of water averaging 2 to 3 miles wide, flowing between Roanoke Island and the mainland. The sound serves a crucial hydrological function, allowing water exchange between the two major sounds, moving tidal influence inland, carrying sediment and nutrients in both directions depending on tide and wind. This connection creates currents that can be surprisingly strong for what appears to be calm water. During certain tidal phases or with particular wind directions, water moves through Croatan Sound with force enough to challenge boats and swimmers. The sound takes its name from the Croatan people who inhabited this region at the time of early European contact, though historical records from that period are sparse and often contradictory. What remains clear is that this coastal region supported substantial Native American populations who understood the sound's productivity, who harvested fish and shellfish, who navigated these waters in vessels adapted to shallow depths and changing conditions. Now the Sound remains an important thoroughfare for modern boat traffic, its channels marked by aids to navigation, its currents studied and mapped. But beneath the surface of human use, the Sound continues its natural functions, mixing waters of different salinities, providing migration corridors for fish moving between sounds and ocean, supporting populations of organisms adapted to brackish conditions, serving as one channel in the complex hydrological system that characterizes North Carolina's coast, where fresh water from inland rivers meets salt water from the Atlantic, creating conditions found nowhere else except where these two water types converge. Black Balsam Knob reaches 6,214 feet elevation, its summit covered not with forest, but with grass and low shrubs, creating open views that extend across the Blue Ridge without obstruction from trees. The grassy character of Black Balsam and surrounding balds represents one of the mountain region's persistent mysteries. These high meadows maintain themselves in areas where climate and soil should support dense spruce fir forest. Various theories attempt to explain the balds: historical grazing, periodic fire, unique soil conditions. But no single explanation accounts for all the evidence. What remains certain is that the balds have existed for as long as written records and oral histories document, and their open character creates landscapes dramatically different from the surrounding forest-covered peaks. Standing on Black Balsam Knob, you stand exposed to weather moving through, clouds forming and dissipating at eye level, wind blowing unobstructed across the grass, storms visible approaching from miles away. The grass itself stays relatively short, bent by constant wind, browning in winter but remaining green through summer. Wildflowers bloom in succession through the growing season, each species having its moment before yielding to the next. The views from Black Balsam encompass dozens of peaks, each one a wave in the mountain ocean, and at sunset, when light strikes the ridgelines at low angles, the mountains take on colors that seem impossible: purples and pinks and golds layered across distance, each ridge a different shade as atmosphere filters and transforms the light passing through it. The broad river flows 150 miles through western North Carolina's foothills before crossing into South Carolina, dropping rapidly through granite formations that create continuous rapids and falls. The river's name describes its character in certain sections: unusually wide for a mountain stream, its waters spreading across broad stone shelves where the granite bedrock lies exposed. These stone platforms create natural features that early settlers recognized and utilized, building mills wherever the river dropped with sufficient force to turn wheels. The granite here is ancient, part of the complex of igneous and metamorphic rocks that forms the Piedmont's foundation, rock that cooled from magma or was transformed by heat and pressure deep underground before erosion exposed it at the surface. The river's work continues the erosion process, water flowing over granite, carrying sand and small stones that act as abrasives, slowly grinding away the bedrock, deepening the channel grain by grain, year by year, millennium by millennium. During floods, the Broad demonstrates its power, rising suddenly, flowing with enough force to move boulders, scouring the channel, reshaping the streambed. But most of the time, the river flows at more moderate levels, creating conditions where the interaction between water and stone becomes visible: pools forming behind natural dams, rapids where the channel narrows, smooth sections where the river spreads across level stone. Fish populations adapt to these varying conditions, finding spawning sites in gravel beds, feeding areas in pools, shelter behind boulders during high water. The river connects mountain slopes with Piedmont lowlands, carrying water and whatever it can erode from higher elevations toward eventual destination in the Catawba watery system and the Atlantic beyond. Caesar's Head State Park straddles the North Carolina-South Carolina border at 3,208 feet elevation, where a massive granite outcrop creates a profile that, with sufficient imagination, resembles a head in profile, hence the formation's name, though the identity of Caesar remains unclear. Perhaps a historical figure, perhaps simply a convenient name applied by early observers. The outcrop rises above the surrounding forest, offering views that extend across multiple ridges toward the Blue Ridge Mountains to the north. The rock itself is part of the extensive granite formations that characterize this region, stone formed deep underground as magma cooled slowly, allowing large crystals to form, giving the granite its distinctive speckled appearance. Over millions of years, erosion removed overlying material, exposing the granite, and continued weathering has shaped the outcrop into its current form. The rock face shows effects of time, lichens covering portions of the stone in patches of gray, green, and orange, cracks where water penetration has begun the slow process of separating blocks, staining where minerals have been dissolved and redeposited. From the overlook at Caesar's Head, the vista encompasses forested slopes that seem to continue endlessly, tree-covered ridges extending to the horizon, each one slightly paler than the last as atmospheric haze filters and scatters light. The area serves as watershed dividing line, with streams on one side flowing toward the Atlantic via South Carolina rivers, those on the other side draining northward into North Carolina systems. This seemingly minor distinction determines the ultimate fate of every raindrop, channeling water into completely different drainage networks that eventually discharge hundreds of miles apart. Oregon Inlet cuts through the outer banks between Body Island and Pea Island, connecting Pamlico Sound with the Atlantic Ocean through a channel that shifts constantly since opening during a hurricane in 1846. Before that storm, this section of the Barrier Islands formed an unbroken strand, but the hurricane's surge carved a new inlet that has remained open, though its exact location and configuration change continuously. The inlet migrates southward at a rate averaging several feet per year, its channel deepening and shoaling in response to currents and storms, defying attempts to stabilize its position. Navigation through Oregon Inlet challenges even experienced mariners. The channel shifts, shoals form and disappear, currents reach remarkable speeds during peak tidal flow, creating conditions where local knowledge becomes essential. The inlet serves as critical passage for fishing fleets based in harbors on the Sound side, providing access to Atlantic waters where commercial and recreational fishing occurs. The bridge spanning Oregon Inlet rises high above the water, allowing boat traffic to pass beneath, its height necessary to accommodate the masts of sailing vessels and the superstructures of larger ships. Standing on the bridge, looking down at the current flowing through the inlet, you can see the forces at work. Water rushing through the narrow opening, creating eddies and whirlpools, carrying sediment from sound to ocean or vice versa depending on tide stage. The inlet remains what it has been since its formation, a temporary feature in geological terms, a gap that will eventually migrate or close as barrier islands continue their slow westward migration, responding to sea level changes and storm impacts across timescales that make human observation periods seem momentary. Water Rock Knob reaches 6,292 feet on the Blue Ridge Parkway, offering views from its summit observation platform that span 4 states on clear days: North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina, all visible from this single vantage point. The knob sits at the crest of the Plot Balsam Range, surrounded by peaks that exceed 6,000 feet, creating a landscape of high ridgelines and deep valleys that characterize the southern Appalachians. The elevation places Water Rock Knob in the zone where spruce fir forests grow, those high-altitude communities dominated by Fraser fir and red spruce, species adapted to conditions similar to those found in Canadian forests far to the north. These trees face constant challenges: ice coating their branches in winter, wind bending and breaking them year-round, short growing seasons, limiting how much they can produce and store before cold returns. The fir trees in particular have been decimated by balsam woolly adelgid, an invasive insect that has killed mature trees across the southern Appalachians, leaving standing dead trunks as gray sentinels among the surviving forest. From Water Rock Knob's platform, accessible by a paved trail from the parking area, the mountain landscape appears as a study in layered distances, the nearest peaks showing individual trees and rock outcrops, middle distance ridges appearing as continuous green masses, far mountains fading to blue silhouettes where atmosphere obscures detail. Weather moves through these heights with remarkable speed, clouds forming seemingly from nothing, rain arriving with little warning, conditions changing in minutes from clear to obscured, and back again. The Tow River flows through the Black Mountains region, named, according to legend, because early settlers stubbed their toes on the river's rocky bottom while attempting to ford its swift current. Whether this etymology is accurate or apocryphal, the name captures something essential about the river. It's rocky, relatively shallow, flowing with enough speed to make crossing treacherous, its bottom strewn with stones worn smooth by constant water flow. The river drains the highest elevations in the eastern United States, gathering water from slopes above 6,000 feet, carrying it down through steep valleys where gradient creates constant motion, water tumbling over rocks in endless cascades and rapids. The Tow's source waters remain cold year-round, fed by springs and seeps emerging from mountainsides where temperatures stay cool even in summer. This cold water creates habitat for brook trout, the only trout native to these mountains, a species requiring pristine water conditions and temperatures that rarely exceed the low 60s, even in warmest months. The river's valley follows a relatively straight course compared to the meandering patterns typical of lower elevation streams, its path determined more by geological structure, flowing along valleys formed by erosion of softer rock between more resistant ridges. Along its banks, rhododendron grows in dense thickets, creating tunnels of vegetation that arch over the water, filtering sunlight into a green glow. The sound of the river fills its valley constantly, not a roar, but a continuous murmur, water speaking in countless voices simultaneously as it moves over rocks of different sizes, around bends, through pools and riffles, each feature adding its tone to the river's perpetual song. Hatteras Inlet separates Hatteras Island from Ocracoke Island, maintaining a navigation channel where tidal currents reach 4 to 5 knots during peak flow, speeds strong enough to challenge boats and create standing waves where current meets opposing wind. The inlet serves as one of few passages through the Outer Banks, connecting the protected waters of Pamlico Sound with the Atlantic Ocean, allowing both commercial and recreational vessels to transit between sound and sea. The inlet's channel requires constant dredging to maintain depth sufficient for larger boats, as sand carried by currents and waves continually shoals the passage. This ongoing battle between human desire for a stable, predictable channel and the natural processes that seek to fill any opening reflects a broader pattern along the Outer Banks. The islands and their inlets are in constant motion, responding to storms, currents, and wave action. refusing to remain fixed in any configuration. Ferry service crosses Hatteras Inlet regularly, carrying vehicles and passengers between the two islands, the crossing taking roughly an hour depending on conditions. During the passage, dolphins often appear, riding the ferry's bow wave or hunting in the inlet's fish-rich waters. The currents flowing through the inlet mix waters from different sources. Fresh water carried from mainland rivers through the sound system, salt water from the Atlantic, each with its own temperature, salinity, and chemical composition. This mixing creates a dynamic environment where conditions change with every tidal cycle, where species from both sound and ocean environments coexist, where the boundary between fresh and salt water remains fluid rather than fixed. Jonas Ridge lies at approximately 4,000 feet elevation in the Blue Ridge, marking a transition zone where the northern hardwood forests that characterize high elevations begin replacing the oak-hickory forests typical of lower slopes. This transition doesn't occur as a sharp line, but as a gradual shift, species mixing across an elevation band where both communities overlap. Below Jonas Ridge, oaks and hickories dominate. Trees adapted to the warmer, drier conditions of lower elevations, their acorns and nuts providing food for wildlife, their leaves turning red and gold in autumn. Above Jonas Ridge, birches, maples, and cherries become more common, species requiring the cooler temperatures and higher moisture that occur at elevation. Their lighter colored bark contrasting with the darker trunks of oaks, their leaves yellowing earlier in fall. The ridge itself experiences conditions between these two zones, creating habitat diversity that supports species from both communities. Walking through forest at Jonas Ridge elevation, you walk through a gradient, elevation determining which species dominate. Subtle changes in altitude creating distinct communities separated by only a few hundred vertical feet. The transition zone serves as particularly rich habitat because it offers resources from both forest types, browse and mast from both elevation zones, diverse understory growth, structural complexity that provides varied nesting and feeding opportunities. The ridge's position also affects weather patterns. Clouds moving through the mountains often form or dissipate at certain elevations, creating fog banks that settle around 4,000 feet, bathing the forest in mist, while slopes above and below remain relatively clear. The Green River flows through Polk County, dropping through the Green River Gorge where Class 4 and V rapids fall through ancient metamorphic rock in continuous cascades that challenge even expert whitewater kayakers. The gorge concentrates the river into a narrow channel where walls rise on both sides, forcing water through passages barely wider than a few boat lengths. The rock here has been folded and faulted by tectonic forces, creating complex structures visible in the cliff faces, layers tilted at sharp angles, different rock types pressed together, evidence of the immense pressures that shaped these mountains. The river has exploited weaknesses in this rock, carving its channel along joints and faults, where erosion proceeds more readily, creating a path through stone that represents millions of years of patient work. During spring runoff, when snowmelt and rain swell the flow, the Green River becomes a thundering torrent, its rapids intensifying, its pools churning, its voice audible for miles as water pounds against rock with force that vibrates through the ground. But even at lower flows, the river maintains continuous motion, tumbling over drops, swirling through pools, creating hydraulics where water curls back upstream, defying the overall downstream flow. The gorge walls support forests that cling to steep slopes, their roots finding purchase in cracks and soil pockets, their canopies creating shade that keeps the gorge floor cool and damp even in summer heat. Moss and ferns grow wherever moisture collects, creating gardens on cliff faces, softening the hard stone with living green that responds to every shift in humidity and light. Richland Balsam reaches 6,110 feet as the highest point on the Blue Ridge Parkway, its summit supporting Fraser fir forests that grow in conditions remarkably similar to Canadian boreal zones despite being located in North Carolina. This vegetation exists here because elevation creates climate. Every 1,000 feet of elevation gain corresponds roughly to a 3 to 5 degree temperature decrease and increased precipitation. At Richland Balsam Summit, temperatures average 10 to 15 degrees cooler than nearby valleys, and the summit receives substantially more rainfall, much of it falling as snow during winter months. These conditions favor Fraser fir and red spruce, trees adapted to cold, moisture, and short growing seasons. The fir trees grow densely, their branches creating a canopy so thick that little light reaches the forest floor, resulting in an understory sparse except for moss and wood sorrel. The trees themselves show signs of stress. Many bear dead tops where ice and wind have broken them. Others lean at angles where wind has pushed them off vertical. The forest floor accumulates deep duff, decades of fallen needles creating a spongy mat that holds moisture and slowly decomposes in the cool, wet conditions. Walking through the forest at Richland Balsam, you walk through an ecosystem displaced southward by elevation, through conditions that would normally occur at latitudes far to the north, through a reminder that altitude and latitude can create equivalent climates. The summit sits shrouded in clouds more often than not, the firs growing in fog that condenses on their needles and drips to the forest floor, providing moisture beyond what falls as rain. The PD River enters North Carolina from the Yadkin River in Montgomery County, flowing through the Sandhills region where ancient beach dunes now sit 100 miles inland from the present coastline. These dunes formed millions of years ago when sea levels stood higher and the ocean reached far into what is now the Piedmont, creating beaches where waves deposited sand in formations identical to modern coastal dunes. When sea level fell, the beaches were left behind, stranded inland, their sand weathered into soils that support distinctive vegetation. Longleaf pine forests adapted to the dry, nutrient-poor conditions that characterize deep sand. The PD flows through this landscape, cutting a valley through sand that shifts more readily than rock, creating a channel that meanders more dramatically than rivers cutting through resistant stone. The riverbanks expose the structure of the ancient dunes, cross-bedding visible in the sand layers, angles that indicate which direction waves approached when these were active beaches. Now the river carries this sand gradually seaward, eroding the ancient beaches grain by grain, transporting them toward modern ocean where they'll eventually be deposited, completing a cycle that has taken millions of years. The river's water flows brown with suspended sediment, tea-colored from tannic acid leached from vegetation, its chemistry reflecting the sandy, acidic soils of the sandhills. Along its course, the PD serves as corridor through a landscape substantially altered by agriculture and development, maintaining riparian forests that provide habitat and connectivity in an otherwise fragmented environment. Sam Knob rises to 6,045 feet in Pisgah National Forest, featuring a grassy summit crowned with pink blooms of Catawba rhododendron in early June. The summit's open character allows unobstructed views across the surrounding mountains, Looking Glass Rock visible to the northeast, the Shining Rock Wilderness stretching north, the Balsam Mountains rising to the south. The Knob belongs to that category of southern Appalachian summits that maintain grassy balds, despite conditions that should support forest, another instance of the phenomenon that appears throughout the high mountains without complete explanation. The grass grows in dense tufts, interspersed with patches of rhododendron and occasional stunted trees that lean away from prevailing winds. The summit experiences weather more intense than surrounding valleys. Wind blows almost constantly, often strong enough to make standing difficult, and storms arrive with little warning, clouds forming overhead and releasing rain or hail within minutes. The exposure creates a feeling of vulnerability, of standing unprotected on the mountain's crown, where sky and earth meet with minimal transition. In winter, the summit accumulates ice and snow that can persist for weeks when valleys below have thawed, creating conditions where the grass disappears beneath white surface that transforms the landscape into something more Arctic than southern. The rhododendron blooms provide brief color each year, their pink flowers opening synchronously in response to temperature cues, attracting bees and other pollinators that work the flowers during the narrow window when conditions favor both blooming and insect activity. Currituck Sound extends 50 miles along the northern Outer Banks, with water that defies expectations, despite the sound's proximity to the Atlantic Ocean and its connection to other brackish sounds. Currituck maintains essentially freshwater characteristics. This peculiar chemistry results from the sound's isolation from saltwater sources. No inlet connects Currituck directly to the ocean, and the sound receives substantial freshwater input from several mainland rivers, while having only limited connection to the more saline Albemarle Sound to the south. The resulting freshwater conditions support aquatic vegetation uncommon in coastal North Carolina. Extensive beds of submerged plants that thrive in fresh water, creating habitat dramatically different from the more saline sounds to the south. These plant beds provide critical habitat for waterfowl, particularly during winter when millions of birds migrate to the region, attracted by the abundant food sources. The sound's shallow depth, rarely exceeding 10 feet, allows light to penetrate throughout, supporting photosynthesis across almost the entire bottom. This creates remarkably productive conditions: underwater meadows that produce vegetation supporting insects, small fish, and ultimately the waterfowl and larger fish that feed on them. The sound's edges grade into marshes dominated by freshwater species rather than the salt-tolerant Spartina grasses found in most coastal marshes, creating a botanical anomaly, a freshwater ecosystem existing at sea level within sight and sound of Atlantic surf. The peculiar conditions exist in a precarious balance, dependent on maintaining current hydrology, vulnerable to changes in freshwater input or saltwater intrusion that could shift the system toward brackish conditions. The Nolichucky River cuts through North Carolina's northwest corner, flowing through a spectacular gorge that drops 2,000 feet over 8 miles through ancient Precambrian rock, some of the oldest exposed stone in the eastern United States, dating back over 1 billion years. The gorge walls rise precipitously on both sides, containing the river in a channel that amplifies its voice, creating a sound environment dominated entirely by the roar of rapids. The river flows with remarkable power, dropping an average of 250 feet per mile through this section, creating continuous whitewater that attracts experienced kayakers seeking challenging conditions. The rock through which the gorge cuts tells stories from Earth's early history, formed before complex life appeared, before oxygen dominated the atmosphere, during a time when the planet operated according to different rules. The stone shows signs of metamorphism, original rock types transformed by heat and pressure into new forms, folded and faulted by tectonic forces that squeezed and deformed the crust. The gorge itself represents the river's victory over this resistant stone, a channel carved through billion-year-old rock by patient erosion, water exploiting every weakness, grinding away grain by grain, deepening the canyon through timescales that dwarf human comprehension. The gorge maintains a wild character despite proximity to roads and development. Its walls too steep for easy access, its rapids too dangerous for casual visitors, resulting in a landscape that remains substantially unchanged from conditions that existed before human arrival, a corridor of wilderness maintained by its own difficulty. Graveyard Fields lies at 5,100 to 5,400 feet elevation in Pisgah National Forest, named for the stumps that resembled gravestones after a massive fire swept through the area in the 1920s, killing the forest and leaving blackened trunks scattered across the landscape. In the decades since, the area has evolved into open meadows with extensive blueberry bushes that fruit in late summer, creating conditions dramatically different from the surrounding forest. The fields maintain their open character partly through succession dynamics. The high elevation, poor soil conditions, and continued browsing by wildlife slow the re-establishment of forest, keeping the landscape in an earlier successional stage longer than would occur at lower elevations. Several waterfalls cascade through the area, streams dropping over rock ledges as they flow from higher elevations toward the valley below. The falls create a sound backdrop, white noise that fills the area with the voice of falling water, a constant presence that becomes noticeable only when you stop to listen. The meadows themselves support diverse wildflowers that bloom in succession through the growing season, each species adapted to the conditions of high elevation, intense sunlight, and cool temperatures. In autumn, the blueberry bushes turn brilliant red, creating fields of color that rival the more famous fall foliage of deciduous forests. The area attracts visitors year-round, hikers exploring the trails to various waterfalls, berry pickers harvesting blueberries in late summer, winter visitors experiencing the fields under snow, when the open landscape becomes a white expanse interrupted only by the dark line of streams still flowing beneath ice. Portsmouth Island lies abandoned since 1971, when the last permanent residents left what had once been a thriving fishing village on the Outer Banks. The island now exists in a transitional state between human settlement and wilderness. Houses still stand, though increasingly weathered by salt spray and storm. Streets remain visible, though salt marsh grass creeps into what were once yards and lanes. The village is becoming a ghost town in the most literal sense, buildings standing empty, while nature reclaims the spaces between, and eventually, the structures themselves. The island's abandonment resulted from the gradual economic and practical difficulties of maintaining community on a barrier island accessible only by boat, with no fresh water source except rainwater collection, no services except what could be brought in by barge, no connection to the power grid or modern conveniences. As older residents died or left for more practical locations, the community dwindled until the last few remaining inhabitants decided the effort to remain had become unsustainable. Now, the National Park Service maintains the village as a historic site, preserving buildings but allowing the overall landscape to evolve naturally. Walking through Portsmouth Village, you walk through recent history becoming archaeology, houses weathering back toward the sand they sit upon, material culture returning slowly to its elements. The island around the village has changed as, well, without grazing livestock or maintenance, vegetation has filled in areas that were once kept clear, and the dune systems continue their natural migration, sand moving with each storm, the entire island slowly shifting westward as all barrier islands do, leaving the village site vulnerable to eventual submersion as sea level rises and the island migrates inland. The Watauga River originates in North Carolina at elevations exceeding 3,000 feet, gathering water from the northwest corner of the state before flowing into Tennessee. The river's headwaters lie in high valleys where spring arrives late and autumn comes early, where winter temperatures regularly drop below zero, where snow can fall from October through April. These cold source waters give the river its character: clear, cold, flowing with the vigor typical of mountain streams. The river has cut valleys through resistant rock, creating a landscape of steep hillsides rising from the water's edge, slopes covered with forest that transitions from hardwoods at lower elevations to conifers at heights. The Watauga Valley has been home to human communities for centuries, though the early settlements have been submerged by reservoirs created for hydroelectric power generation. Now, the river flows through a series of lakes, its natural character interrupted but not entirely eliminated. Above the reservoirs, the river continues in its original form, a mountain stream tumbling over rocks, creating pools and runs that support trout populations. The river's name comes from a Cherokee word, though its exact meaning remains debated, perhaps referring to the village that stood near the river, perhaps to some characteristic of the water itself. The name persists across the changes in river and landscape, connecting present conditions to earlier times when the valley looked different, but the river followed essentially the same course, flowing from high elevations in North Carolina toward eventual junction with the Tennessee River system. Clingman's Dome reaches 6,643 feet on the North Carolina-Tennessee border, the second highest peak in the eastern United States, located in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The summit receives over 85 inches of precipitation annually, more than most locations in the eastern United States, with much of that falling as snow during winter months when the summit can remain buried under several feet of accumulation for weeks at a time. This heavy precipitation supports the spruce fir forests that cover the upper slopes, creating conditions similar to those found in northern Canada. The summit area features an observation tower, a concrete spiral ramp leading to a platform that offers 360-degree views across the Smokies when weather permits, though weather frequently doesn't permit, as the summit sits shrouded in clouds more often than not. The tower rises above the tree line, providing views over the fir forest canopy when clouds aren't present. On rare days of complete clarity, visibility extends over 100 miles, encompassing dozens of mountain ranges receding into distance, each ridge a variation in blue as atmosphere filters and scatters light differently at different distances. But these clear days are exceptional. Normally, the summit exists in mist and cloud, creating an environment where visibility extends only dozens of yards, where the forest appears as gray shadows in fog, where the distinction between sky and land becomes uncertain. The fir trees at this elevation show signs of stress. Many stand dead, killed by balsam woolly adelgid or by the accumulated effects of ice, wind, and acid precipitation. These standing dead trunks, called ghost forests, create an eerie landscape, particularly when fog moves through, making the dead trees appear to float in white emptiness, disconnected from ground or sky. The Pungo River flows through Beaufort County as a classic blackwater river, its slow current barely perceptible as it winds through coastal plain toward Pamlico Sound. The water is stained dark brown, nearly black, by tannic acid leached from vegetation decomposing in the surrounding swamps and moccasins. This color creates unusual optical effects. The water appears deep, even in shallow areas, and reflections of trees and sky are more vivid than in clear water, as if the tannins concentrate and enhance reflected light. The river supports fish species adapted to low oxygen, acidic conditions, species that have evolved to extract oxygen efficiently from water, where decomposition processes consume much of the available dissolved oxygen. The pungo moves through landscape that has remained relatively undeveloped, wetlands too difficult to drain or farm, too remote to attract intensive settlement. Along its banks, cypress trees grow in formations that have persisted for centuries, individual trees that may be several hundred years old, their trunks massive, their branches creating canopies high overhead. Spanish moss hangs from these branches, gray-green curtains that sway in the slightest breeze, adding to the atmosphere of a landscape operating according to different temporal rules than the surrounding modern world. The river serves as corridor for wildlife, otters fishing in the dark water, herons stalking prey in shallows, alligators at the northern limit of their range basking on logs or banks. In early morning, before wind disturbs the surface, the river becomes a perfect mirror, reflecting the surrounding swamp forest so clearly that it's difficult to distinguish water from air, reality from reflection, creating a moment of visual symmetry that makes the landscape seem to double, as if the world extends equally in two directions from the river's surface. Shining Rock Wilderness contains white quartz outcrops that gleam in sunlight at elevations between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, giving the wilderness area its distinctive name. The quartz formations are exposed masses of this resistant mineral, essentially pure silicon dioxide, left standing as softer surrounding rock eroded away. Quartz reflects light brilliantly when clean and wet, and the outcrops in Shining Rock catch sunlight and seem to glow, visible from miles away as bright spots on the mountainside. The wilderness protects nearly 20,000 acres of high-elevation landscape, including grassy balds, spruce fir forests, northern hardwood slopes, and the distinctive quartz outcrops that gave the area its name. The terrain is rugged, steep slopes, few maintained trails, conditions that require navigation skills and physical fitness. This difficulty has preserved the wilderness character, keeping the area less visited than more accessible locations despite its remarkable landscape features. The quartz outcrops appear throughout the wilderness at various elevations, each one a mass of white stone standing out against the forest or grass. The rock itself is inert, resistant to chemical weathering, breaking down primarily through physical processes, freeze-thaw cycles that crack the stone, temperature changes that cause expansion and contraction, slowly fracturing the massive outcrops into progressively smaller pieces. This process occurs slowly, measured in geological time, with observable change occurring over thousands rather than dozens of years. The wilderness designation protects the area from development, allowing natural processes to continue without human interference, preserving not just the quartz outcrops, but the entire ecosystem they're part of. Maintaining a landscape that demonstrates what these mountains look like when allowed to evolve according to their own dynamics rather than human intentions. Bogue Sound separates Bogue Banks from the mainland along 21 miles of North Carolina's central coast, a body of water that averages less than 6 feet deep throughout most of its length. This shallowness creates conditions where sunlight penetrates to the bottom, supporting seagrass beds that grow in dense meadows across much of the sound floor. The grasses sway with tidal currents, creating underwater landscapes that shift and move in rhythms that match the ocean's breathing. These seagrass beds serve crucial ecological functions. They stabilize sediment, preventing erosion. They filter water, removing suspended particles and improving clarity, and they provide nursery habitat where juvenile fish find both food and shelter from predators. The sound receives freshwater input from mainland creeks and saltwater from inlets connecting to the Atlantic, creating brackish conditions that vary with rainfall and tide. Species adapted to these intermediate salinities thrive here. Blue crabs patrol the bottom, flounder bury themselves in sand, shrimp migrate through on their way between nursery and ocean habitats. The Sound's edges grade into salt marsh, Spartina grass growing in zones determined by tidal flooding, creating a transition between water and land that's neither fully one nor the other. In early morning, before boat traffic and wind disturb the surface, the Sound lies mirror smooth, reflecting the sky and the islands, creating a space of perfect stillness where water and air seem interchangeable, where the boundary between surface and reflection becomes impossible to determine with certainty. The Noland Divide reaches elevations of 5,000 feet in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, forming a long ridge that creates distinct weather patterns on either side through what's known as a rain-shadow effect. Prevailing winds blow from the west, carrying moisture-laden air that rises as it encounters the mountains. As the air rises, it cools, and cooling air can hold less moisture, so clouds form and precipitation falls on the western slopes. By the time the air crosses the ridgeline and descends the eastern slopes, it has lost much of its moisture, creating drier conditions on the lee side of the divide. This rain-shadow effect creates measurable differences in precipitation. Western slopes receiving substantially more rainfall than eastern slopes, supporting different vegetation communities adapted to the varying moisture availability. The divide itself experiences the full force of weather systems moving through. Wind funnels along the ridgeline, clouds form and dissipate at the crest. Storms arrive with intensity magnified by elevation and exposure. Trees growing along the divide show the effects of this constant weather stress, trunks leaning away from prevailing winds, branches growing asymmetrically, growth rings narrow from years of difficult conditions. The ridge serves as watershed boundary, streams on one side flowing toward Little Tennessee River, those on the other side feeding different tributaries, every raindrop's ultimate destination determined by which side of the divide it falls upon, a geographic lottery played out billions of times with every storm. The Roanoke Rapids once dropped 90 feet over a series of cascades on the Roanoke River, creating one of the most dramatic waterfall sequences in eastern North Carolina. The rapids formed where the river encountered resistant rock, creating multiple ledges over which water tumbled in a spectacular display of gravitational force. Native Americans fished the rapids for thousands of years, taking advantage of the fall's concentrating effect. Fish migrating upstream gathered at the base of falls, creating predictable harvesting opportunities. Early European settlers recognized the rapids' power potential, eventually building mills that harnessed the falling water to grind grain and saw lumber. In the 1950s, dam construction submerged the rapids beneath a reservoir, ending their existence as flowing water feature, transforming them into a memory preserved in historical accounts and photographs. The rock shelves still exist beneath the reservoir's surface, occasionally visible during extreme low water conditions when the reservoir drops substantially. But they no longer shape the river's character as they did for millennia. The submersion represents a common pattern. Many of North Carolina's most dramatic river features have been drowned by reservoirs, their power captured for electricity generation, their natural beauty traded for the economic benefits of hydroelectric power. The rapids exist now primarily in memory and in the geological formations that still lie beneath the reservoir's surface, waiting in darkness, unchanged by their submersion, ready to appear again should water levels ever drop permanently. Middle Prong Wilderness in Pisgah National Forest contains old-growth hemlock forests at elevations between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. Groves of trees that have escaped logging and fire, maintaining the forest structure that once characterized much more of the southern Appalachians. The hemlocks grow on steep mountain slopes where difficulty of access protected them from the intensive logging that cleared most of the region's original forests in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These trees are centuries old, their trunks reaching diameters of several feet, their crowns rising to form a dense canopy that filters sunlight into a green twilight at ground level. The forest floor beneath old hemlocks accumulates a deep layer of needles, creating a spongy carpet that muffles sound and holds moisture. Walking through these groves feels like entering a different era. The scale of the trees, the quality of light, the silence broken only by bird calls and wind in branches high overhead, all combine to create an atmosphere of age and persistence. Unfortunately, these ancient hemlocks face a serious threat from hemlock woolly adelgid, an invasive insect that has killed hemlocks throughout the eastern United States. Many trees in the wilderness show signs of infestation and decline, their needles thinning, their crowns dying back. The fate of these old-growth groves remains uncertain. Some trees may survive, developing resistance or benefiting from biological controls, but many will likely die, transforming the forest from hemlock-dominated stands to communities of different species that will occupy the space hemlocks once filled. The Alligator River flows through a wilderness area in northeastern North Carolina, widening into swamp forest, where the river becomes difficult to distinguish from the surrounding wetland. Here, at the northern limit of American alligator range, these reptiles exist in conditions more challenging than the warm swamps of Florida or Louisiana. Winters can be cold enough that alligators must enter dormancy, burying themselves in mud at the bottom of ponds or rivers, remaining motionless for weeks while temperatures stay too low for activity. The river and surrounding swamp provide habitat for diverse wildlife beyond alligators. Black bears roam the forests. Red wolves have been reintroduced to the area as part of recovery efforts, and the wetlands support countless wading birds that feed in shallow waters. The river itself flows so slowly that current becomes nearly imperceptible, its movement detectable only by watching floating leaves or debris drift almost imperceptibly downstream. The water is dark with tannins, stained by the organic matter decomposing in acidic conditions, creating a color that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Cypress trees grow directly from the water, their trunks buttressed at the base for stability in saturated soil, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hangs like tattered curtains. The area maintains a wild character, despite proximity to developed regions. The swamp's difficulty of access has preserved it, creating a landscape that demonstrates what much of the coastal plain once looked like before drainage and development transformed most wetlands into agricultural land. Mount Craig reaches 6,647 feet as the second highest peak in eastern North America, located just north of Mount Mitchell in the Black Mountains. The summit sits only 4 feet lower than Mount Mitchell, making the two peaks nearly equal in elevation, both towering above the surrounding landscape in a range that contains numerous peaks exceeding 6,000 feet. Mount Craig experiences the same harsh conditions as Mount Mitchell, temperatures averaging 15 to 20 degrees cooler than nearby valleys, winter conditions that can include sustained periods below zero, ice coating trees for weeks at a time, winds that regularly exceed 50 miles per hour. These conditions support spruce fir forests at the summit, though like forests throughout the Black Mountains, the Fraser firs are dying from balsam woolly adelgid infestation, leaving standing dead trees among the living spruce. The peak was named for Loch Craig, a North Carolina governor from the early 20th century, though the mountain's significance long predates this naming. It was simply another high peak in a range that Native Americans knew intimately, that early explorers recognized as exceptionally tall. From Mount Craig's summit, views extend across the Black Mountains and beyond to more distant ranges, though the summit sits in clouds more often than not, shrouded in mist that reduces visibility to yards rather than miles. The peak experiences weather systems in their full intensity. Storms that bring light rain to valleys can bring heavy snow to the summit, where temperatures remain below freezing even when lowlands enjoy spring warmth. Bald Creek flows through Yancey County from elevations above 5,000 feet, beginning as seeps and springs on high slopes where water emerges from underground and begins its journey toward lower elevations. The creek drops rapidly, falling through mountain coves, those protected valleys where slopes rise steeply on multiple sides, creating sheltered spaces that moderate temperature extremes and maintain high humidity. These coves support particularly rich forests, communities of diverse tree species, including yellow poplar, basswood, and numerous others that thrive in the moist, protected conditions. The creek tumbles over rocks worn smooth by constant water flow, creating pools and cascades, the sound of falling water filling the cove with white noise that masks other sounds. The water remains cold year-round, rarely exceeding the low 60s even in summer, fed by groundwater and surface flow from higher elevations where temperatures stay cool. This cold water creates habitat for brook trout and other species, requiring pristine water conditions and low temperatures. Along the creek's banks, rhododendron grows in dense thickets, creating tunnels of vegetation that arch over the water, their leaves evergreen through winter, their flowers blooming in early summer. The creek eventually joins the Tow River, contributing its flow to that larger stream, but in its upper reaches, Bald Creek maintains the character of a mountain stream, small, cold, clear, flowing with the energy typical of water descending steep gradients, carving its channel deeper into the mountainside with every flood, following the path it has traced for thousands of years through stone and soil. The Sand Hills region stretches across south-central North Carolina, a distinctive landscape where ancient ocean beaches now sit elevated and stranded 100 miles from the present coastline. These formations date to geological periods when sea levels stood higher and the Atlantic Ocean reached far inland, creating beaches and dunes at locations that now lie well within the continental interior. When sea levels fell, the beaches remained, their sand weathering into soils that support ecosystems dramatically different from the surrounding Piedmont. The dominant vegetation is longleaf pine forest, trees adapted to the dry, nutrient-poor conditions that characterize deep sand. Longleaf pines grow slowly, but can live for centuries, developing thick bark that protects them from fire. In fact, these forests depend on periodic fire to maintain their character, flames clearing undergrowth and releasing seeds from cones that require fire's heat to open. The Sand Hills landscape features rolling terrain, the topography reflecting the dunes' original shapes despite millions of years of weathering. In places, you can still see cross-bedding and exposed sand, layers tilted at angles that indicate which direction waves approached when these were active beaches, fossil wave patterns preserved in the structure of the sand itself. The Sand Hills support unique species adapted to the dry conditions, wiregrass growing in tufts between pine trees, various scrub oaks, and fauna that includes specialized insects and reptiles found nowhere else. The region exists as an anomaly, a remnant of earlier sea levels, demonstrating how dramatically conditions can change over geological time, how beaches can become inland features. how the present landscape preserves evidence of past geographies. Cold Mountain rises to 6,030 feet in Pisgah National Forest, isolated from the main Blue Ridge crest, standing somewhat apart from nearby peaks in a way that increases its visual prominence. The mountain gained wider recognition through the novel bearing its name, but its geographic significance predates literary fame. It's a substantial peak, requiring a steep 5-mile hike to reach the summit, a climb that gains over 2,500 feet of elevation. The trail passes through different forest types as it ascends, oak-hickory forests at lower elevations giving way to northern hardwoods higher up, the transition marking the change in temperature and moisture that occurs with increasing altitude. The summit offers views across multiple mountain ranges, though the peak sits exposed to weather that can change rapidly. Storms arriving with little warning, clouds forming at the summit even when valleys below remain clear. The mountain's name may refer to the temperatures experienced at its heights, or perhaps to cold air drainage that creates cooler conditions at certain elevations, though the exact origin remains uncertain. What's clear is that Cold Mountain maintains a remote quality despite its proximity to roads and towns. The long, steep approach keeps casual visitors away, preserving a sense of wilderness that many more accessible peaks have lost. The summit area features exposed rock and stunted trees shaped by wind and ice, vegetation growing in forms that reflect the harsh conditions they endure, creating a landscape more alpine than typical southern Appalachian forests, demonstrating how elevation creates climate zones that would normally be separated by hundreds of miles of latitude. The Scuppernong River winds through Washington and Tyrrell counties as a blackwater tributary, its slow current barely noticeable as it meanders through cypress swamps. The river's name comes from a variety of grape native to the region, suggesting the abundance of these vines in the river valley when the area was first settled. The water moves with a patience that seems almost stillness, flowing so gently that it's difficult to determine which direction the current flows without watching floating objects for extended periods. The river's dark color, nearly black in deep pools, results from tannic acid leached from vegetation decomposing in the acidic swamp waters. This color creates visual effects where depth becomes difficult to judge, where the water seems to hold more darkness than mere depth would suggest. Cypress trees line the river, growing directly from the water, their trunks massive in places where old-growth trees have stood for centuries. These cypresses create their own ecosystem. Their knees protruding above the waterline provide habitat for various organisms. Their canopies shade the water and drop leaves that become food for aquatic insects. Their roots stabilize banks and create shelter for fish. The river serves as corridor through a landscape that has changed substantially. Much of the surrounding area has been drained and converted to agriculture, but the river itself and the immediate swamp forest remain relatively intact, maintaining the character they've held for millennia. In early morning, mist rises from the dark water, creating scenes that appear timeless, unchanged from how this river might have looked before human settlement altered the surrounding landscape. Deep Gap sits at 3,182 feet on the Blue Ridge Parkway where U.S. Highway 421 crosses, marking a major break in the mountain chain. Gaps like this form where erosion has carved deeper valleys through the ridgeline, creating natural passages that both wildlife and humans have used for millennia. Deep Gap serves as a wind funnel. Air moving across the mountains accelerates through these breaks in the ridgeline, creating conditions where wind blows more strongly than on surrounding slopes. This concentration of wind affects vegetation, stunting trees and creating growth forms adapted to constant exposure. The gap also serves as a migration corridor, Birds and insects moving through the mountains often follow these natural breaks rather than crossing the highest peaks, making gaps like deep gap concentration points where diverse species can be observed during migration periods. The gap marks a transition in watersheds. Streams on one side flow toward the Atlantic. Those on the other side drain toward the Gulf of Mexico via the Tennessee River system. This seemingly minor distinction determines the ultimate fate of every drop of water, channeling it into completely different drainage networks. Standing in Deep Gap, you stand at a place where geography shapes both ecology and history, where the mountain's configuration influences movement patterns for everything from wind to wildlife to human traffic, where the landscape's structure creates conditions that differ from those just a few hundred yards away on either side of the gap. The Cashiers Plateau lies at approximately 3,500 feet elevation in Jackson County, forming a high valley surrounded by peaks that reach over 5,000 feet. This creates a basin-like configuration where the plateau floor sits elevated above the surrounding lowlands, but protected by higher mountains on all sides. The plateau's elevation moderates summer temperatures, while lowland areas experience heat and humidity. The plateau maintains cooler conditions that attracted summer residents from lowland regions even before air conditioning made heat more tolerable. The surrounding peaks create a rain shadow effect, with the plateau receiving less precipitation than higher elevations, creating conditions somewhat drier than might be expected at this altitude. The plateau supports diverse vegetation that reflects its intermediate elevation. Species from both lower and higher elevations overlap here, creating habitat diversity. Several rivers originate on or flow through the plateau, including the Chattooga, Tuckasegee, and Horse Pasture rivers, each beginning its journey from high elevation sources before dropping through gorges as they descend from the plateau. These rivers create some of the most dramatic waterfalls in the region, water plunging over resistant rock layers in cascades that drop hundreds of feet. The plateau has been settled since early European colonization, attracted by the moderate climate and relatively level terrain, a rarity in the mountains where most land slopes steeply. Now the area serves as both year-round community and seasonal destination, its elevation providing relief from lowland heat, while its protected character moderates the harsh conditions experienced at the highest peaks. The Cataloochee Valley in Great Smoky Mountains National Park sits at 2,600 to 3,000 feet elevation, surrounded by mountains rising to 6,000 feet that create a protected basin. This configuration has preserved the valley's character. It's remote enough that it receives fewer visitors than more accessible park areas, maintaining a sense of isolation and tranquility. The valley once supported a thriving community, farms and homesteads scattered across the basin floor and lower slopes. But when the national park was established, residents were relocated and the valley began reverting to forest. Now, old home sites are visible as clearings in the forest, foundations and chimneys marking where buildings once stood, apple trees still fruiting, though the orchards that surrounded them have been reclaimed by forest. The valley supports a reintroduced elk herd, animals that once roamed these mountains but were extirpated by overhunting, now returned to demonstrate what the landscape once held. The elk graze in meadows, their bugling calls during autumn rut echoing off the surrounding mountains. The valley's streams support brook trout populations in cold, clear water flowing from higher elevations. The surrounding mountains create their own weather patterns. Clouds form and dissipate within the basin. Fog settles in the valley bottom during certain conditions, and the protected character moderates temperature extremes that affect more exposed locations. Walking through Cataloochee Valley, you walk through a landscape in transition, human history visible in remnants of settlement, but natural processes reasserting themselves. the forest reclaiming what was briefly cleared, the valley returning toward conditions that existed before European settlement, but never quite erasing the evidence of that human presence. Big Butte rises to 5,200 feet on the Appalachian Trail, its rounded summit typical of southern Appalachian grassy balds that maintain themselves through processes that remain incompletely understood. The summit name reflects the mountain's shape, rounded, humped, rising gradually, rather than peaked. And the informal naming captures something essential about southern mountain nomenclature, which often prioritizes descriptive accuracy over formality. The summit area is treeless despite elevation and conditions that should support forest, grass covering the rounded top, creating open views in every direction without any tree-based obstruction. Wind moves freely across the summit, bending the grass in patterns that show the breeze's direction and strength, creating visual effects as the grass ripples and waves. The bald supports wildflowers that bloom in succession through the growing season, different species taking their turns, creating changing palettes of color against the background green. The summit experiences the full force of weather moving through. Storms arrive rapidly, clouds forming at the summit level, rain or snow falling while valleys below remain clear. The exposure creates conditions where trees cannot establish or maintain themselves, though the exact mechanisms remain debated. Walking across Big Butte's summit feels like walking on the Earth's surface in a more direct way than forest-covered peaks permit. There's no canopy mediating the relationship between land and sky. No trees creating intermediate space, just grass and stone beneath and sky above. Wind moving between them, weather systems passing through, the mountain standing as it has for ages, wearing away slowly while maintaining its essential character. The White Oak River flows 48 miles through Onslow and Carteret counties, beginning as a modest stream in the coastal plain and widening into a tidal estuary before entering Bogue Sound. The river's character changes dramatically along its length. Upper reaches flow as a typical blackwater stream, dark with tannins, moving through forested wetlands, while lower sections widen substantially and become influenced by tides. Saltwater pushing upstream during flood tide, freshwater flowing seaward during ebb. This creates a mixing zone where fresh and salt water interact, where salinity varies with location and tide stage, where species adapted to different salinity levels coexist in a dynamic environment that changes twice daily. The river's name suggests the oak trees that grow along its banks, though the exact origin remains unclear, perhaps referring to water oaks, perhaps to white oaks, perhaps simply to the light color of sandbanks exposed at low tide. The estuary serves as nursery habitat for numerous fish and shellfish species that spend their juvenile stages in the protected, food-rich waters before migrating to ocean environments as adults. Salt marshes line the lower river, spartina grass growing in zones determined by tidal flooding, creating a gradual transition between river and upland. The white oak moves through a landscape that has been substantially altered, much surrounding land converted to agriculture and development. But the river itself maintains its essential character, still flowing from inland regions toward the coast, still mixing fresh and salt water in its lower reaches, still serving as corridor and habitat for species that depend on estuarine conditions. Grandfather Mountain's famous cliff dwellings are actually overhanging rocks at 5,000 feet elevation, where temperature remains cool even in summer, supporting rare plant species that require the specific conditions found in these sheltered locations. The overhangs create microenvironments, spaces protected from direct sun and rain, where temperature fluctuates less than exposed sites, where humidity stays higher than surrounding areas. These unique conditions allow species to persist that would otherwise be unable to survive at this elevation or latitude, creating botanical anomalies where northern species exist far south of their normal ranges. The plants growing in these protected sites include species more typical of regions hundreds of miles north, brought south by the cool, stable conditions that the rock overhangs create. The cliff dwellings themselves consist of massive rock shelters formed where resistant layers overhang softer material that has eroded away, creating spaces large enough to walk into, ceilings high enough to stand beneath. These shelters have been used by humans for thousands of years. Native Americans found them convenient stopping points. Early settlers used them for temporary shelter. Modern hikers rest within them during storms. But the shelter's primary significance lies in the specialized habitats they create, the botanical refugia, where species persist in isolated populations, cut off from others of their kind by distance and climate, maintained only by the peculiar conditions that exist beneath these overhanging rocks at high elevation, where cool temperatures and protected positions combine to create something unique. The Pigeon River flows through Haywood County from 5,000 feet elevation in the Balsam Mountains, beginning as cold mountain streams that converge into progressively larger channels as they descend toward the valley floor. The river follows a steep gradient in its upper reaches, dropping rapidly through forested slopes, creating conditions where the water never quite settles into calm flow, but constantly tumbles over rocks and through cascades. As the river reaches lower elevations and enters broader valleys, its character changes. The gradient decreases, the channel widens, the flow becomes more deliberate, though still energetic. The Pigeon eventually joins the French Broad River, its water continuing northward into the Tennessee River system, eventually reaching the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. The river's name may refer to now extinct passenger pigeons that once migrated through in vast flocks, though documentation of this etymology remains uncertain. What's clear is that the pigeon serves as a drainage for a substantial watershed, gathering water from the balsams and surrounding ranges, concentrating it into a single channel that flows through increasingly developed landscapes as it descends. The upper watershed remains relatively wild, forests covering steep slopes where development is impractical, but lower sections flow through towns and past industries that have used the river for power, transportation, and waste disposal. Despite these uses, the river maintains its essential character, still flowing from high elevations toward eventual meeting with the French Broad, still carving its channel deeper, still responding to flood and drought according to patterns established long before human presence complicated its story. Mount Hardy reaches 4,547 feet in Burke County, offering views from its summit where the Blue Ridge Mountains transition toward the Piedmont lowlands. From this vantage point, the geographic shift from mountain to plain becomes visible. To the west, successive mountain ridges recede into blue distance, while to the east, the land descends toward the rolling terrain of the Piedmont, forests giving way to a landscape of hills rather than mountains. This transition zone has ecological significance. Species reach their range limits here, whether extending as far east as they can tolerate from the mountains or as far west as they can penetrate from the Piedmont. The summit area supports vegetation typical of mid-elevation mountains, oak hickory forests with an understory of mountain laurel and rhododendron, creating dense thickets that make off-trail travel difficult. The views from Mount Hardy demonstrate the dramatic topographic change that occurs across relatively short distances in western North Carolina, from peaks exceeding 6,000 feet to Piedmont elevations below 1,000 feet, all visible from a single location. the entire elevation transition encompassed in a single vista. The mountain serves as viewpoint and transition marker, standing at the edge of two physiographic provinces, demonstrating how dramatically landscape character can change, how mountains rise from plains through processes that create boundaries visible from space, but equally apparent from any high point where the view extends far enough to encompass the shift from one landscape type to another. The Haw River Falls near Bynum drop 6 to 8 feet over granite formations, creating one of the few natural waterfalls remaining in the Piedmont region, where most dramatic water features have been modified or eliminated by development and dam construction. The falls formed where the river encounters resistant granite that erodes more slowly than surrounding rock, creating a ledge over which water tumbles. The drop is modest compared to mountain waterfalls that plunge hundreds of feet, but in the Piedmont context, any substantial fall becomes significant, a break in the general pattern of gently flowing rivers. The granite here is exposed bedrock, the underlying stone that forms the Piedmont's foundation, usually buried beneath soil and sediment, but revealed wherever rivers cut, deep enough to reach it. The falls demonstrate the river's power. Flowing water has carved potholes in the granite downstream from the falls, circular depressions ground out by rocks trapped in eddies, spinning in place for years or decades, abrading the stone in circular patterns. The falls have been used by humans for centuries. Native Americans fished here, early settlers built mills that harnessed the falling water, and now the site serves as recreational destination, accessible via short trails from nearby parking. But the falls maintain their essential character. Water still drops over the same granite ledge, creating the same sound, generating the same mist, continuing the erosion process that will eventually wear away the rock completely, though that wearing away proceeds so slowly that the falls appear permanent, unchanging, solid, and fixed, despite being actively engaged in their own slow disassembly. The Balsam Mountains form the highest range in the Blue Ridge system, with 16 peaks exceeding 6,000 feet, creating the border between Jackson and Haywood counties, at elevations where spruce fir forests thrive in conditions similar to regions 1,000 miles north. These mountains represent the southern Appalachians at their most extreme, highest elevations, harshest weather, most dramatic temperature differences between summit and valley. The range runs roughly northeast to southwest, its ridgeline forming the eastern continental divide along much of its length, water flowing westward toward the Gulf of Mexico or eastward toward the Atlantic depending on which side of the crest it falls. The balsams receive substantial precipitation, over 80 inches annually at the highest elevations, much of it falling as snow during winter when temperatures stay below freezing for extended periods. This heavy precipitation supports the spruce fir forests that characterize the highest elevations, though these forests face challenges from invasive insects, acid precipitation, and climate change that threatens to shift the elevation zones where different species can survive. Walking along the Balsam Ridgeline feels like traveling through boreal forests that should exist in Canada rather than North Carolina. The smell of evergreen needles, the dense shade beneath fir canopy, the cool temperatures even in summer, all create conditions more typical of regions far to the north, brought south by elevation's ability to create climate zones that mirror those found at different latitudes. The range stands as the southern Appalachian's highest continuous ridgeline, a barrier that influences weather patterns, creates distinct ecosystems on different slopes, and serves as refuge for species that require the cool, moist conditions found only at these highest elevations where mountains reach into clouds more often than not.